Carl Jung explained, 12 spiritual realizations that only come through solitude. There's a secret that the architects of modern society desperately don't want you to discover. It's not hidden in ancient texts or locked away in forbidden libraries. It's hidden in the one place you've been systematically trained to avoid, the depths of your own silence. Carl Jung knew this secret, and it nearly cost him everything: his reputation, his sanity, his place in the psychiatric establishment. But what he found in his own deliberate descent into solitude between 1913 and 1916 became the foundation of insights that would eventually revolutionize our understanding of the human psyche. He called this period his confrontation with the unconscious. Most people would have called it a complete psychological breakdown. But here's what Jung discovered in that terrifying isolation, and here's what the machinery of modern civilization works over time to prevent you from discovering. Your solitude isn't a problem to be solved. It's a doorway to psychological sovereignty that threatens every system designed to keep you unconscious, obedient, and externally validated. Think about it. When was the last time you sat in complete silence for an hour, with no phone, no music, no distractions, no escape routes? If you're like most people, that question just triggered a small wave of anxiety. That anxiety isn't accidental. That anxiety is the guard dog that's been installed at the threshold of your own depth. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires something society has convinced you is dangerous, antisocial, even pathological: extended periods of chosen solitude where you face the full weight of your own consciousness without distraction or defense." Over the next 3 hours, we're going to walk through 12 spiritual realizations that can only come through this confrontation with solitude. These aren't comfortable truths. These aren't Instagram-worthy affirmations. These are the initiatory experiences that separate people who perform consciousness from people who actually embody it. This is your invitation into the forbidden gateway. Comment solitude if something in you recognizes what we're about to explore, if you've felt the pull toward isolation and been told there was something wrong with you for wanting it. Because that pull, that's not pathology. That's your psyche trying to lead you home. Let's begin with a question that might disturb you. What if everything you've been taught about loneliness is designed to keep you psychologically imprisoned? Modern society has performed a brilliant linguistic sleight of hand. It has collapsed two fundamentally different experiences, solitude and loneliness, into a single pathological category. Solitude, the chosen withdrawal into your own depths, has been rebranded as loneliness, the painful experience of feeling cut off from connection. And this rebranding isn't innocent. It's a defense mechanism protecting the collective from conscious individuals. Jung understood something that threatens the entire architecture of mass society: individuated people. People who have completed the journey into their own psychological depths cannot be easily controlled. They cannot be manipulated by advertising because they've stopped seeking external validation. They cannot be herded by social pressure because they've discovered an internal locus of authority. They cannot be distracted by entertainment because they've tasted something more nourishing than stimulation. Meaning, this is why your solitude is dangerous to the system, not dangerous to you, dangerous to the machinery that requires your unconsciousness to function. Think about the design of modern life. You wake up to an alarm, an external authority telling you when to begin consciousness. You scroll social media before your feet touch the floor, immediately plugging into the collective nervous system, checking what reality you're supposed to inhabit today. You move through your day in a carefully choreographed performance for bosses, colleagues, friends, family. You consume media that tells you what to think about the news, what to desire in your relationships, what problems you should be anxious about. You collapse into bed, scrolling again. Your final conscious moments spent mainlining other people's curated realities. Where in this cycle are you alone with yourself? Where is the space for the question Jung said was the most important question? Who am I when no one is watching, when no role is being performed, when no mask is required? The answer is nowhere. The space has been systematically eliminated, and it's been eliminated because that space is where you would discover the most dangerous truth. You are not who you've been performing. The person you present to the world, the helpful one, the successful one, the spiritual one, the rebel, the conformist, whatever your persona, is a costume. And beneath that costume is something society hasn't approved, something you've spent your entire life keeping contained. Jung called this the shadow, and it can only be met in solitude. But before we can talk about meeting your shadow, we need to understand why you've been made terrified of the silence where that meeting occurs. Let's talk about what Jung called mass psychosis, the collective unconsciousness that masquerades as consensus reality. When Jung looked at the rise of fascism in Europe, he didn't just see political movements. He saw psychological infection, millions of people fleeing from the terror of their own consciousness into the comforting certainty of collective identity. The individual, in his words, became dissolved into the mass, and in that dissolution, people became capable of atrocities that would have been unthinkable if they'd maintained individual consciousness. Now, I'm not suggesting that modern consumer culture is equivalent to fascism, but I am suggesting that the psychological mechanism is identical. The flight from individual consciousness into collective identity. It's just that instead of fleeing into nationalism, we flee into brand loyalty. Instead of fleeing into political ideology, we flee into social media tribes. Instead of rallying around a Führer, we rally around influencers. The content changes, the mechanism remains identical, and the mechanism is this: anything to avoid sitting alone with the totality of your own being. Because when you sit alone with the totality of your own being, you discover something absolutely destabilizing. Most of what you call yourself isn't actually you. It's downloaded programming, it's internalized parents, it's cultural conditioning, it's trauma responses, it's defense mechanisms, it's the persona, the mask you wear to survive in the social world. And this brings us to the first great terror of solitude. When there's no audience, the performance stops making sense. The mask starts to feel ridiculous. You're alone in your room, performing confidence, performing niceness, performing whatever character you've constructed, and suddenly you realize, for whom? There's no one here to validate this performance. This is the moment most people reach for their phone. This is the moment the anxiety spikes. This is the moment you've been trained to call loneliness, and to fix immediately by reconnecting with the external world. But Jung would say, this moment is sacred. This moment is the crack in the persona where light gets in. This moment is the first glimpse of authentic consciousness trying to emerge from beneath the performance. Let me introduce you to David. David was a corporate executive who came to Jung in his mid-40s with what he described as a creeping existential dread. He had everything society told him to want: prestigious career, beautiful family, impressive home, respected position in his community. And yet, he told Jung, he felt like he was drowning in success. Jung gave David what seemed like strange advice: spend one full day each week in complete solitude. No work, no family obligations, no structured activities. Just David alone with himself. David lasted 45 minutes the first time before having a panic attack. What David discovered in that panic, and what he would eventually discover through months of maintained solitude practice, was that his entire personality was a performance script written by other people. His father's expectations, his mother's anxieties, his culture's definition of masculinity, his corporate environment's model of leadership. David, the actual person beneath all those scripts, was still a teenager, the age he'd been when he made the unconscious decision to abandon authentic self-exploration and start performing the role of successful man. The panic wasn't a malfunction. The panic was David's true self, suffocating under 30 years of persona, maintenance, finally getting a chance to scream. In solitude, David had to face a question he'd been running from his entire adult life. If I'm not the successful executive, the strong father, the respected community member, if those are just roles I perform, then who am I? This question is death. The ego experiences it as death. And this is precisely why society has made solitude feel like a pathology rather than an initiatory practice. Because when you ask this question in true solitude, you can't escape into distraction. You can't outsource the answer to a therapist, a guru, a partner, a religion. You have to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. You have to allow the false self to die so the true self can be born. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." And yet society insists on a uniform size. It insists that there is a correct way to be human, a proper developmental trajectory, an approved template for a good life. And anyone who doesn't fit that template, there must be something wrong with them. They need to be fixed, medicated, counseled back into conformity. Solitude reveals this as the lie it is. In solitude, you discover that the template never fit in the first place. You were always too much this, too little that, too weird here, too intense there, for the standardized version of humanity society tried to pour you into. And here's what this means. Your entire social anxiety, your fear of judgment, your constant self-monitoring, all of it is based on the unconscious belief that there's a correct way to be, and you're doing it wrong. Solitude demolishes this belief because in solitude there's no one to perform correctness for. There's just the raw fact of your existence. Strange, contradictory, excessive, deficient, beautiful, ugly, all of it at once. This is terrifying. This is also liberation. Let me be very clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you should become a hermit. I'm not saying connection is bad or community is unnecessary. What I am saying is that authentic connection, the kind Jung said was essential to psychological health, can only occur between people who have done the solitude work of discovering who they actually are beneath their personas. Otherwise, what you call connection is just personas networking with each other, masks recognizing masks, performances validating performances. This creates the bizarre modern phenomenon where you can be surrounded by people constantly and still feel utterly alone. Because you are alone, your true self is alone, buried beneath the performance, never actually meeting anyone. The irony is profound. It's not solitude that creates isolation. It's the refusal of solitude that creates isolation. Because the refusal of solitude means the refusal to know yourself. And if you don't know yourself, you can't be known by others. You can only be seen in the role you perform. Jung spent significant time working with what he called the persona problem in his patients. He noticed that many people, particularly by midlife, had become so identified with their social masks that they'd lost complete contact with the living personality underneath. They were, in his words, empty suits, presentations of a person with no one actually inside. These patients would come to him in crisis, depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness, addiction, and Jung would tell them something that initially sounded insane. Your symptom is not your enemy. Your symptom is yourself trying to shatter the persona prison you've built. Your depression is not a malfunction. It's your psyche's refusal to keep performing a life that isn't yours. This is radical psychology. This suggests that much of what we medicalize as mental illness is actually the psyche's healthy response to an unhealthy situation, the situation of living completely alienated from your authentic being. And this is where solitude becomes not just important, but essential, because you cannot differentiate persona from personality, false self from true self, without extended time away from the social pressure that keeps the mask welded to your face. Let me give you a diagnostic tool, what I call the mask maintenance cost inventory. This is something you can only do honestly in solitude, and I encourage you to pause this video and actually try it. First, identify your primary persona, the mask you wear most consistently. Maybe it's the competent professional, the loving parent, the spiritual seeker, the tough survivor, the nice person who never causes problems. Whatever your main social identity is. Now, in solitude, ask yourself, what am I not allowed to be when I'm performing this persona? If your persona is the strong one, you're not allowed to be weak, needy, confused, afraid. If your persona is the spiritual one, you're not allowed to be angry, petty, jealous, materialistic. If your persona is the successful one, you're not allowed to be failing, uncertain, or lost. Make a list of everything your persona forbids. This is your shadow inventory, the aspects of yourself you've had to exile to maintain the performance. Now here's the disturbing part. Calculate how much psychic energy you expend daily maintaining this repression. Every time a forbidden feeling arises and you suppress it to maintain the mask, that costs energy. Every time you perform the approved persona instead of expressing an authentic impulse, that costs energy. Every time you monitor and edit yourself to stay in character, that costs energy. For most people, by the time they've maintained a rigid persona for decades, they're exhausted at a soul level. They describe feeling drained, empty, disconnected from life. And they've been taught to think this is just normal adulthood. It's not. It's the cost of constant self-betrayal. David, our corporate executive, realized that he spent approximately 80% of his waking energy maintaining his persona, managing his image, suppressing unwanted emotions, performing confidence he didn't feel, projecting control he didn't have. The remaining 20% was barely enough to keep him functional. No wonder he felt like he was drowning. He was drowning in the performance. In solitude, you can't maintain this expenditure. The energy naturally returns to you because there's no audience demanding the performance. And in that return of energy, you start to feel something you may not have felt since childhood: vitality, aliveness, the sense that existence itself is interesting without needing to be curated for external consumption. This is what society fears, not your isolation, your vitality. A vital person can't be sold solutions to manufactured problems. A vital person can't be controlled by anxiety about social status. A vital person is dangerous to every system that requires your unconsciousness to extract value from you. And this brings us full circle to why your solitude is treated as pathological. The culture doesn't fear your loneliness. It offers 1,000 products to solve loneliness. The culture fears your solitude, your deliberate chosen withdrawal from the collective to discover who you are underneath what you've been told to be. Because that person, that undiscovered authentic person waiting beneath your persona, that person is ungovernable. Jung wrote this in a private letter that was only published after his death. The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. For this, he needs the evidence of inner, transcendent experience, which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass. Let me translate what Jung meant by God here, because he was deliberately provocative with religious language. He didn't mean belief in an external deity. He meant direct contact with the self, the totality of your being, the God image within, the ordering principle that's larger than your ego. And this contact, Jung insisted, only comes through what he called inner work, the deliberate encounter with your own depths that requires solitude. Without this anchoring in direct self-knowledge, you will be submerged in the mass. You will be blown around by collective opinions, social trends, cultural anxieties. You'll outsource your sense of reality to external authorities, media, influencers, experts, institutions. You'll spend your life reacting to stimuli instead of creating from your center. This is the stakes of solitude. This is why it matters. Not because it feels good, it often feels terrible. Not because it's comfortable, it's profoundly uncomfortable. But because it's the only laboratory where you can conduct the most important experiment, discovering who you are when all external reference points are removed. Pause this video for a moment, take 3 deep breaths, and ask yourself honestly, when was the last time I was completely alone with myself, with no agenda, no distraction, no escape route? If you can't remember, or if the thought of it creates anxiety, you're exactly who this message is for. And before we go deeper, I need to warn you about something. The journey we're about to take through the remaining chapters, meeting your shadow, encountering the self, integrating the opposites, all of it requires that you've at least opened the door to genuine solitude. If you're still running from silence, if you're still treating aloneness as a problem to be solved, the deeper teachings won't land. They'll remain intellectual concepts instead of lived experiences. So the gateway is here. The question Jung posed to every person who came to him with psychological suffering: are you willing to be alone with what you've spent your life avoiding? If the answer is yes, or even if the answer is, I'm terrified but I need to try, then keep watching. We're about to step through the forbidden gateway together, and on the other side, nothing will look the same. Now we descend into the architecture of the false self, the carefully constructed prison you built to survive, but which has become the thing you need liberation from. Jung called it the persona, taking the term from ancient Greek theater, where actors wore masks, personas, to indicate which character they were portraying. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. You are still wearing the mask. You just forgot it's a mask. You've become so identified with the character you perform that you've lost contact with the actor underneath. The persona is not inherently bad. In fact, it's necessary. You need a social interface, a way of presenting yourself that allows you to function in different contexts. The doctor persona when you're treating patients, the parent persona when you're with your children, the professional persona when you're at work. These are useful adaptations. The problem isn't that you have a persona. The problem is when you become nothing but persona, when the mask has completely consumed the living face underneath, when you can no longer tell the difference between your authentic self and your social performance. And this is where solitude becomes both terrifying and necessary. Because in solitude, the persona has no function. There's no one to perform for. The mask starts to slip. And what's underneath? That's what we're afraid to discover. Let me take you deeper into David's story, our corporate executive from Chapter 1. After his initial 45-minute panic attack during his first attempt at solitude, David wanted to quit the practice entirely. He told Jung, "This isn't helping. It just makes me feel worse. I'm more anxious, not less." Jung's response was something David hadn't expected. "Good. The anxiety is information. What is it telling you?" David, being a solutions-oriented executive, didn't like this response. He wanted Jung to fix the anxiety, not analyze it. But Jung insisted, your anxiety is the guardian of the threshold. It's protecting something you don't want to see. What is it protecting? Over weeks of maintained solitude practice, which David approached with the same discipline he brought to his career, a disturbing realization began to emerge. David noticed that whenever he was alone, he would mentally rehearse future conversations, planning what he would say in tomorrow's meeting, crafting the perfect response to a colleague's challenge, imagining how he'd tell a story at dinner that would make him seem witty and in control. Even alone, David was performing. He was practicing his lines for an audience that wasn't even there. This is the horror of complete persona identification. The performance becomes automatic. You no longer need an actual audience because you've internalized an imagined audience that's constantly watching, constantly judging, constantly requiring you to be on. Jung would say that David had committed what he called the crime against the self, the murder of the authentic personality in favor of a socially acceptable substitute. And the punishment for this crime? A life that looks successful on the outside while feeling utterly meaningless on the inside. David's persona was built on three primary pillars, which he mapped out during his solitude sessions. First pillar, control. David's persona required that he always be in control of himself, of situations, of other people's perceptions of him. This meant no vulnerability, no spontaneity, no genuine emotional expression. Everything had to be calculated and managed. Second pillar, competence. David's persona required that he always know what to do. He could never be confused, lost, or uncertain. He had to project the image of a man who had figured life out. Questions without answers were forbidden. Not knowing was weakness. Third pillar, invulnerability. David's persona required that he need nothing from anyone. He could give advice, provide for others, be relied upon, but he could never be in a position of genuine need himself. This meant no asking for help, no admitting struggle, no showing the places where he was actually broken. Look familiar? These are three of the most common persona patterns in modern culture, particularly for men. And David discovered something profound. These three pillars, which he thought were his actual personality, his actual values, his actual self, were installed by external forces. The control requirement, his father who punished any emotional expression with either rage or cold withdrawal. The competence requirement, the school system which sorted children into winners and losers based on their ability to regurgitate approved answers. The invulnerability requirement, cultural masculinity, which taught him that needing others was humiliating weakness. None of it was actually David. It was downloaded programming masquerading as identity. In solitude, David could no longer sustain these performances. There was no father to impress, no colleagues to manage, no culture to prove anything to, and in the absence of the external reinforcement that kept the persona in place, it began to crack. The first crack came when David found himself weeping uncontrollably during a solitude session, for no reason he could identify. Not sad crying, he didn't even know what he was sad about, just uncontrollable tears like something that had been pressurized for decades was finally releasing. The second crack came when David had a spontaneous fantasy during meditation of smashing every piece of furniture in his perfectly curated home office, destroying the very symbols of his success. This fantasy disturbed him deeply. Was he going insane? Was he dangerous? Jung helped him understand. These weren't signs of illness. These were signs of health. His authentic self was finally strong enough to start dismantling the persona prison. The tears were the vulnerability he'd exiled. The rage was the authentic power he'd sublimated into controlled competence. His psyche was essentially saying, "We can't continue like this. Something real needs to emerge." But here's what makes this process so terrifying. When the persona starts to crack, you don't immediately have access to the authentic self underneath. There's a gap, a period Jung called the void, or the night sea journey, where you're not the person you were performing, but you don't yet know who you actually are. This gap is where most people retreat. They patch up the persona, reinforce it, maybe swap it out for a slightly different version, trade the corporate executive persona for the conscious entrepreneur persona, same structure, different costume. They never allow the full dismantling that would be required for authentic transformation. David almost did this. About 3 months into his solitude practice, he came to Jung and said, "I think I've figured it out. I just need to quit my job and do something more meaningful. That's the solution." Jung's response stopped David cold. What makes you think your new story about yourself is any more true than your old story? You're just trading one persona for another. This was devastating for David because Jung was right. David had unconsciously created a new persona, the man who had a spiritual awakening and courageously changed his life. That was just as inauthentic as the old one. Different performance, same mechanism. Jung pushed David to go deeper. Stop trying to figure out who you should be. That's still the ego trying to control the process. Instead, use your solitude to discover who you actually are, even if that person doesn't fit any story you find acceptable. This is the crucial distinction most people miss. Self-discovery is not self-creation. You're not a blank slate that you get to design according to your preferences. You're a living being with an actual nature, and self-discovery is the process of removing everything that's covering that nature up. Think of it like sculpture. You're not building a self out of positive traits and approved qualities. You're chiseling away everything false until what was always there can be revealed. And you don't get to choose what's revealed. You only get to choose whether you're willing to encounter it. Jung developed a specific practice for persona work that he taught to many of his patients, including David. He called it the 3 questions practice, and it can only be done in solitude. Question 1, who am I when no one is watching? This seems simple, but actually sit with it in silence for 20 minutes and notice what emerges. Most people discover they have no idea how to answer this question. They only know who they are in relation to others' perception of them. Remove that mirror, and there's a disturbing blankness. Question 2, what am I not allowed to be? This exposes the persona's restrictions. Make a list of everything your primary social identity forbids you to be. If you're the nice person, you're not allowed to be selfish, angry, or difficult. If you're the successful person, you're not allowed to be failing or confused. If you're the spiritual person, you're not allowed to be materialistic, petty, or judgmental. This list is your shadow inventory. We'll go much deeper into shadow work in the next chapter, but it's also your persona's rule book. These are the qualities you've exiled to maintain your social mask. Question 3. What would I do if I knew no one would ever know? This is perhaps the most revealing question because it exposes the gap between your public performance and your private truth. If you knew with absolute certainty that your action would never be witnessed, never be judged, never affect your reputation, what would you do? Where would you go? How would you live? For David, this question revealed something he'd been refusing to admit even to himself. If no one would ever know, he would leave his marriage. Not because his wife was bad or because the marriage was abusive, but because it had become another performance, another role he was trapped in. Devoted husband was part of the persona package, and the truth, which made him feel like a terrible person to admit, was that he didn't love her. He loved the story of their relationship, the image they projected, the life they'd built. But the actual woman, the actual connection, it had been dead for years, maybe had never been alive in the first place. This is the kind of truth that emerges in deep solitude, truth that's so threatening to your persona that you'd rather not know it. David had to sit with this recognition for months before he knew what to do with it, and Jung didn't tell him what to do. Jung's role wasn't to give advice. Jung's role was to make sure David didn't run away from the knowledge. Let me pause here and address something important. I'm not advocating that everyone should blow. up their lives. I'm not saying you should quit your job, leave your marriage, abandon your responsibilities. What I am saying is that you can't make authentic decisions about your life until you know your authentic truth. And you can't know your authentic truth while you're still identified with your persona. David eventually did leave his marriage, but that wasn't the point of the work. The point was that David stopped being a man who lived according to external scripts and became a man who could access his own internal truth. What he did with that truth was a secondary question. The persona work is about liberation, not lifestyle. It's about psychological freedom, not necessarily external change. Some people do the persona work and realize they actually love their life. They just needed to choose it consciously instead of performing it unconsciously. Others realize they've been living someone else's life entirely, and significant external changes are necessary. Both outcomes are valid. What's not valid is remaining unconscious, continuing to perform without knowing you're performing, wearing the mask without knowing it's a mask. Jung gave a powerful metaphor for this. The persona is like a suit of armor. When you're on the battlefield, you need it, but you're not supposed to wear it to bed. You're not supposed to wear it in the bath. You're not supposed to have it welded to your skin so permanently that you forget you can take it off. In solitude, you learn to remove the armor. And yes, it's terrifying at first, because the armor was protecting you. It was protecting you from judgment, from rejection, from being seen in your full complexity. But it was also suffocating you. The same armor that protects eventually imprisons. There's a stage in persona work that Jung called the inflated persona, when you've become so identified with your social mask that you start to believe you actually are the idealized image you project. This is particularly common in helping professions, spiritual communities, and leadership roles. The therapist who believes they have no problems because they're the one who solves problems. The spiritual teacher who believes they've transcended ego because they're the one teaching egolessness. The CEO who believes they're a visionary because that's what their marketing says. These are all examples of inflated persona. The mask has become so rigid and so identified with that the person has lost all contact with their actual humanity. Solitude is absolutely brutal to an inflated persona, because in solitude you can't maintain the performance, and the gap between your idealized self-image and your actual psychological reality becomes unavoidable. Let me share something personal here. About 7 years ago, I was deeply identified with a spiritual seeker persona. I was the person in my community who had read all the books, done the retreats, could quote the teachers. My entire identity was wrapped up in being further along the path than others, sophisticated, awakened, beyond petty concerns. Then I went on a 10-day silent retreat. Real solitude, no distractions, just me and my mind. And what I discovered was humiliating. I was a complete fraud, not a deliberate fraud. I genuinely believed my own performance. But beneath the spiritual persona was a deeply insecure person using spirituality as a defense against feeling inadequate. I wasn't seeking enlightenment. I was seeking superiority. I wasn't interested in truth. I was interested in being the person who had the truth. This recognition almost broke me. I spent 3 days of that retreat in a state of shame so intense I considered leaving early. My persona had cracked, and what was underneath was not the evolved being I'd been projecting. It was a frightened child in spiritual drag. But this humiliation was also the beginning of something real, because once I stopped performing spirituality and started actually encountering my own shadow material, the insecurity, the grandiosity, the use of consciousness work as a weapon against others, I could begin genuine transformation. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. There is no approved template for an awakened person, a successful person, a good person. These are all social constructs, persona categories. Your actual task is to discover your particular shape, your particular nature, and to live from that, regardless of whether it fits the approved templates or not. In David's case, after about a year of consistent solitude work combined with therapy, something remarkable happened. The persona didn't just crack, it dissolved. And in that dissolution, David experienced what Jung called the psychological death and rebirth. For about 3 weeks, David described feeling completely empty, not depressed. He'd been through depression before, and this felt different. Just empty, like a house where all the furniture had been removed. The persona structures that had given his life shape were gone, and new structures hadn't yet formed. He was in the void. Jung told him, "This is the most important time. Don't try to fill the emptiness with a new story, a new identity, a new persona. Just be empty. Let yourself be nothing for a while. The something that emerges from genuine nothing will be more real than anything you could construct." David described this period as both terrifying and strangely peaceful. Without the constant energy expenditure of persona maintenance, he felt a freedom he'd never experienced. Simple things became interesting again. Walking without purpose, eating without planning, existing without agenda. He was learning to just be, rather than to constantly be someone. And gradually, naturally, a new way of being emerged. Not a new persona. David was vigilant about not falling back into performance, but a more fluid, more authentic relationship with social roles. He could still be professional when needed, but he wasn't trapped in the professional identity. He could still be a father, but he wasn't performing fatherhood according to a script. He was just present, available, real. The people in David's life had mixed reactions to this change. Some found it refreshing. They said he seemed more relaxed, more genuine, easier to connect with. Others found it disturbing. They preferred the predictable, controlled David they could rely on to play his part. A few relationships ended because they'd been based entirely on persona interactions and couldn't survive the introduction of actual authenticity. Jung warned about this. The descent into the unconscious is not a family affair. Your individuation process will disturb the people around you, particularly those who are still identified with their own personas. Your authenticity becomes a mirror that reflects their inauthenticity, and most people don't want to see that reflection. This is another reason why solitude is essential. You need a space that's protected from social pressure while you're doing this work. You need somewhere you can let the mask drop without immediately being pressured to put it back on. Before we move to the next chapter, I want to give you a practical tool for beginning your own persona work. This is an exercise you can do in solitude, and I encourage you to actually do it rather than just consuming it intellectually. The persona audit set. Aside 1 hour where you won't be disturbed. Get a journal or notebook. Part 1. Identification right at the top of the page. I am a person who always. Then complete that sentence as many times as it feels true. I am a person who always helps others. I am a person who always has it together. I am a person who always stays positive, etc. These are your persona's core commitments, the identities you're maintaining. Part 2. Restriction. For each identity you listed, write underneath it. This means I'm not allowed to. For example, if you wrote, I am a person who always helps others, underneath, write, this means I'm not allowed to be selfish, to say no, to prioritize my own needs. These are the costs of each persona element, what you've had to repress to maintain that identity. Part 3. Origin. For each identity, ask, where did this identity come from? Who installed this requirement? Be specific. Was it a parent, a traumatic event, a cultural message, a religious teaching? Write down the origin story of each persona element. This helps you see that most of what you think is just who you are was actually installed by external forces. Part 4, the forbidden question. Now comes the dangerous part. For each identity you've listed, ask yourself in complete honesty, if I could let this go without anyone judging me, would I? Don't answer what you think you should say. Don't answer based on your values or your ideals. Just notice, does your body relax or tighten when you imagine releasing this identity? Does something in you feel liberated or terrified? Whatever arises is information. You're not committing to changing anything. You're just mapping the architecture of your persona cage so you can start to see where the doors might be. Part 5, the cost calculation. Finally, try to honestly assess, how much energy does maintaining this persona cost me daily? If you had to assign a percentage, what percentage of your vital energy goes into performing and maintaining this social mask? For David, the answer was 80%. For most people who do this exercise honestly, the answer is shockingly high. We're exhausted not because life is inherently exhausting, but because constant self-betrayal is exhausting. One more thing before we go deeper. I need to warn you about a common trap in persona work. Some people respond to recognizing their persona by trying to destroy it aggressively. They rebel against every social expectation, reject all roles, and pride themselves on being authentic in a way that's actually just another persona, the rebel persona, the authentic persona, the person who has no persona. This is spiritual bypassing, wearing a different mask. True integration means you can wear the persona when it's useful without being possessed by it. You can play social roles without losing yourself in them. The goal isn't to eliminate the persona, it's to establish conscious relationship with it, so you're the one choosing when and how to use it, rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. Jung put it perfectly. The persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. That this is so is obvious. The solution comes when one is able to separate oneself from the persona. Separation, that's the key word. Not destruction, separation. Learning to distinguish, this is my persona, from this is myself. And that work of separation requires solitude, because only in solitude can you stop performing long enough to discover who's underneath the performance. If this chapter has unsettled you, good. That's not cruelty, that's confirmation that something real is being touched. The persona doesn't want to be examined. It will create anxiety, resistance, intellectual objections, sudden urgent reasons why you need to stop watching this video and do something else. But if you're still here, if something in you is saying, yes, I need to see this, then trust that impulse. Comment persona if you're recognizing your own mask in this exploration. Not to perform recognition, I know the irony, but to mark for yourself that you're serious about this work. Because now we descend deeper. If the persona is everything you present to the world, the shadow is everything you've hidden from others and from yourself. And meeting your shadow is where solitude becomes not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous. Let's go there now. There's a presence in your house that you've never introduced yourself to. You've felt it move in peripheral vision. You've heard it whisper in moments of anger you immediately suppress. You've sensed it watching you from behind your socially acceptable thoughts. You've been taught to call it your dark side, your demons, the parts of yourself you need to overcome. Jung had a different name for it, the shadow. And he had a radically different understanding of what it is and what to do with it. The shadow is not evil. The shadow is not the enemy. The shadow is the archive of everything you had to exile to become acceptable. It's the unauthorized biography your ego refuses to publish. It's every quality, every impulse, every aspect of your being that got labeled bad, dangerous, or unacceptable, and was subsequently banished to the basement of your unconscious. And here's what makes the shadow so important. That basement also contains your power, your creativity, your vitality, your authentic desire, your real anger, your genuine authority. Everything that was too much, too intense, too alive for the constrained social performance you were required to maintain, all of it went into shadow, which means you are not complete without your shadow. You're actually half a person presenting an edited version of yourself as though it were the whole. And the exhaustion you feel. That's the cost of the civil war inside your psyche, the constant energy expenditure required to keep the shadow locked away. Solitude is where the shadow stops being theoretical and becomes immediate, because when you're alone with yourself, truly alone, there's no one to perform goodness for. There's no one to prove your acceptability to. And in that absence of external judgment, the shadow begins to emerge. Let me introduce you to Sarah. Sarah came to Jung in her late 30s, presenting as what she described as a spiritual seeker in crisis. She'd spent 15 years building a reputation as a yoga teacher, meditation instructor, and workshop facilitator, focused on compassion and loving kindness. Her entire identity was wrapped around being peaceful, non-judgmental, and spiritually evolved. And then, during a month-long solo retreat in a mountain cabin, something erupted that shattered her entire self-image. Sarah described it like this: I was meditating, doing my compassion practice like I'd done thousands of times, and suddenly I had this visceral fantasy of screaming at all my students, telling them how fake and performative they were, how exhausted I was by their endless neediness, how much I despised the way they treated me like some enlightened being when I was just as lost as they were. The rage was so intense I scared myself. I thought I was having a breakdown. Jung's response: congratulations, you've finally met your shadow. Sarah was horrified. But I'm not an angry person. I've worked for years to transcend anger. I teach loving kindness. This can't be who I really am. And here Jung delivered the teaching that would eventually transform Sarah's entire relationship with herself. Your shadow is not who you really are. And your persona, the peaceful, loving, spiritual teacher, is also not who you really are. Both are partial truths. Your work is to integrate them both into a more complete picture of your total being. This is the crucial insight most people miss about shadow work. The shadow is not your true self hiding beneath your false self. It's more complex than that. Both the light persona you present and the dark shadow you repress are real aspects of you. Neither is the complete truth. Integration means bringing both into consciousness and allowing a more authentic, more whole version of yourself to emerge from their union. Sarah's shadow contained rage, yes, but let's understand where that rage came from. When Sarah was a child, her mother was emotionally unstable, cycling between loving warmth and explosive anger. Sarah learned early that her survival depended on being calming, soothing, never triggering her mother's volatility. She became the peaceful child, the good girl, the one who could regulate everyone else's emotions. This wasn't a choice. It was an adaptation to an impossible situation. And it required Sarah to exile every bit of her own anger, her own needs, her own intensity. Those qualities were too dangerous in her family system, so they went into shadow. By the time Sarah became an adult, this adaptation had calcified into identity. She wasn't just performing peacefulness. She believed she was peaceful. She'd completely identified with the persona and lost all conscious contact with the shadow. But, and this is where Jung's psychology becomes profound, the shadow doesn't disappear just because you stop acknowledging it. It goes underground. it becomes unconscious, and from that unconscious position, it starts to control you in ways you don't recognize. Sarah would attract the most difficult, dramatic students to her workshops, people with endless problems and crises, people who would demand her time and energy without reciprocation. And Sarah would feel martyred, exhausted, used, but would never set boundaries because a truly spiritual person doesn't reject anyone. Jung helped her see this wasn't spiritual maturity. This was shadow projection. Sarah had exiled her own needs, her own anger, her own capacity to say no. So instead of consciously owning those qualities, she was unconsciously creating situations that would make her feel them, but in a way where she could still maintain her "I'm a good person who never gets angry" persona. The students weren't the problem. Sarah's refusal to integrate her shadow was the problem. This is how the shadow operates when it remains unconscious. It sabotages you. It attracts exactly the situations that will trigger the emotions you're trying to avoid. It ensures that what you refuse to face consciously will confront you externally in the form of difficult people or bad luck or repeating patterns. Jung called this projection, the mechanism by which we cast our shadow onto others and then react to them as though they were the problem. Let me give you the shadow projection diagnostic. This is something you can only see clearly in solitude. Make a list of the qualities you most hate in other people. Don't be polite. Don't be spiritual about it. What qualities, when you encounter them in others, trigger immediate disgust, rage, or contempt? Maybe it's arrogance. Maybe it's neediness. Maybe it's fakeness. Maybe it's laziness. Maybe it's aggression. Whatever makes you think, "I could never respect someone who acts like that." Write it down. This list is a map of your shadow. Every quality you react to with disproportionate emotion in others is almost certainly a quality you've exiled in yourself. This seems impossible at first. Sarah insisted she didn't have an arrogant bone in her body. Humility was core to her identity. But Jung pushed her. Tell me about how you view people who aren't spiritual, who aren't doing inner work, who are just living ordinary materialistic lives. And there it was. Sarah had tremendous contempt for what she called unconscious people. She looked down on people who weren't seeking enlightenment. She felt secretly superior to her family members who worked regular jobs and watched television. Her spiritual identity was actually a cover for profound arrogance. She just hid it behind the language of compassion. This recognition was devastating for Sarah. It meant everything she'd built her identity on was compromised. She wasn't the humble, loving person she thought she was. She was someone using spiritual practice as a defense against feeling ordinary, using compassion as a performance to hide judgment. But here's what Sarah discovered through months of shadow work in solitude. That arrogance, when brought into consciousness and integrated, wasn't actually arrogance. It was healthy self-esteem and legitimate ambition that had been twisted into something unhealthy because it had to remain hidden. Sarah discovered she wanted recognition. She wanted to be seen as skilled, talented, even exceptional at what she did. She wanted financial success. She wanted influence. These aren't evil desires, they're normal human aspirations. But because they didn't fit her humble spiritual seeker persona, they'd gone into shadow where they became distorted into secret superiority and judgment of others. When she could finally own these desires consciously, yes, I want to be recognized as excellent at what I do. Yes, I want financial abundance. Yes, I want authority in my field. They lost their toxic quality. She could pursue these things directly, honestly, without the spiritual bypassing. This is what Jung meant by shadow integration. You don't eliminate the shadow qualities. You bring them into consciousness where they can be transformed from unconscious compulsions into conscious choices. Let me take you through what Jung called the 4 stages of shadow integration. This is a map for the work you'll do in solitude. Stage 1, recognition. This is where you identify that you have a shadow at all. Most people are in complete denial about this. They think the person they consciously believe themselves to be is the total truth. Recognition begins when you notice projection, the qualities in others that trigger disproportionate emotional reactions. Those reactions are signals. Your psyche is saying, look at this is in you too. In solitude, recognition comes through practices like free writing, where you allow uncensored thoughts to emerge. You write, I hate people who, and then don't stop yourself. Don't edit, don't spiritualize, just write the raw truth. What emerges will show you your shadow. Stage 2, ownership. This is the hardest stage. Ownership means you stop saying, I would never, and start saying, I am capable of. You admit that you contain the very qualities you've been condemning. If arrogance is in your shadow, ownership means admitting, I am arrogant sometimes. I do feel superior to others. I do judge people for not being as conscious as I think I am. Saying these statements out loud in solitude is physically difficult. Your body will resist. Your throat will tighten. Shame will flood through you. That's how you know it's real. Shadow work. If it's comfortable, you're probably just performing shadow work, another persona game. Stage 3, dialogue. This stage uses Jung's active imagination technique, which we'll explore in depth in Chapter 7. But briefly, you personify your shadow and speak with it as though it were a separate being. You ask it questions. You listen to its responses. You treat it as a part of yourself that has intelligence and motivation, not just as a problem to be fixed. Sarah did this practice with her angry woman shadow figure. She would sit in solitude and invite this figure into conversation. Why are you so angry? What do you need? And she would allow responses to emerge, not from her conscious mind trying to figure it out, but from the unconscious directly. The angry woman told Sarah things like, I'm angry because you've let everyone use you. I'm angry because you've made yourself small. I'm angry because you have power and you refuse to use it. This wasn't pathological anger. It was the anger of a healthy self that had been suppressed for decades. Stage 4, integration. Integration doesn't mean you start acting out every shadow impulse. It means you bring the shadow quality into consciousness, where you can work with it consciously. You don't become your shadow. You integrate your shadow. For Sarah, integration looked like this. She maintained her spiritual practice and her genuine compassion, but she added healthy boundaries. She started saying no to students who were extracting her energy without reciprocity. She raised her prices to reflect her actual skill level. She stopped apologizing for her expertise. She allowed herself to be ambitious openly. None of this made her less spiritual. It made her more whole. She was no longer split between saintly persona and rejected shadow. She was becoming an integrated person who contained both light and dark, both compassion and power, both humility and healthy pride. Jung wrote what I consider one of his most important statements. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Let me tell you why this statement is revolutionary. It completely inverts the spiritual paradigm most people operate from. Most people think spiritual growth means becoming more light, more good, more transcendent of darkness. They think the goal is to eventually eliminate all shadow qualities and become pure light. Jung is saying the exact opposite. Enlightenment comes not from eliminating darkness, but from making it conscious. The person who has integrated their shadow is not someone who has no darkness. They're someone who knows their darkness, who has relationship with it, who can work with it consciously, rather than being controlled by it unconsciously. This is why the most dangerous people are often those who believe they have no shadow. The spiritual teacher who thinks they've transcended ego. The activist who thinks they're purely motivated by justice. The helper who thinks they have no selfish needs. These are the people most vulnerable to shadow possession. When the unconscious shadow suddenly erupts and takes control, usually in spectacular, destructive ways. We've all seen this. The spiritual teacher caught in sexual abuse scandals. The moral crusader revealed to be doing the exact thing they condemned. The family therapist whose own family is in chaos. These aren't failures of character. They're failures of shadow integration. These people didn't do the work of making their darkness conscious, so the darkness took control unconsciously. Now let me share something personal, because I don't want to just analyze other people's shadows without acknowledging my own. My major shadow element is cruelty. I present, both in these videos and in my life, as someone interested in helping people, in consciousness work, in evolution and growth. And that's genuinely true. Those are real values I hold. But in solitude, when I'm honest with myself, I can feel a part of me that enjoys being psychologically incisive in a way that can be cutting. There's a part of me that gets satisfaction from seeing through people's defenses, from knowing what they're hiding from themselves. And there's a subtle cruelty in that seeing, a way I can use insight as a weapon. I discovered this shadow element during a long solitude period when I was journaling about why I was attracted to Jung's work in the first place. And I had to admit, part of the attraction was the power of psychological knowledge, the ability to see through people, to know their personas, their shadows, their defense mechanisms, and therefore to be superior to them, to be safe from them because I understood them and they didn't understand me. This recognition was humiliating. It meant my helper identity was partially a cover for power-seeking. My interest in consciousness wasn't purely benevolent, it was also strategic, a way to maintain control through knowledge. But, and this is the important part, once I brought this into consciousness, I could work with it. I could notice when that cruel, power-seeking impulse was arising and make a choice about whether to act from it or not. I could use my psychological insight in service of genuine help rather than in service of subtle domination. The impulse didn't disappear, but it came under conscious authority rather than unconscious control. This is what integration looks like in practice. It's not purity, it's consciousness. Let me give you a powerful shadow practice you can do in solitude, what I call the forbidden thoughts inventory. This is intense, so only do it if you're actually ready to see your shadow. Set a timer for 20 minutes. Get a notebook that no one else will see. This has to be completely private or you won't be honest. Write this prompt at the top. The thoughts I'm not supposed to have are. Then just write. Don't stop. Don't edit. Don't judge. Don't spiritualize. Write the thoughts you have about others that you'd never admit. Write your secret judgments, your hidden resentments, your unacceptable desires, your taboo fantasies. Write the observations you make about people that you immediately suppress because they're too mean, too sexual, too dark, too honest. This will be uncomfortable. You'll want to stop. You'll want to perform goodness even in your private journal. Don't. The whole point is to let the shadow speak without censorship. What you'll discover in this practice is that you have thoughts and feelings you've been refusing to acknowledge as yours. You've been saying, I'm not the kind of person who thinks like that, while constantly having those exact thoughts and then immediately suppressing them. This suppression takes enormous energy, and it doesn't make the thoughts go away. It just makes them unconscious, where they control you without your knowledge. Jung worked extensively with dream analysis as a way to encounter shadow material, because the shadow appears in dreams as all the characters you find threatening, repulsive, or fascinating. The thief breaking into your house in a dream. That's your shadow. The aggressive person attacking you, shadow. The sexually inappropriate figure, shadow. The judgmental critic, shadow. Your dreams are showing you the parts of yourself you refuse to see consciously, and they'll keep showing you in increasingly intense forms until you pay attention. Sarah's dreams during her solitude period were instructive. She kept dreaming of a wild woman, unkempt hair, loud voice, sexually provocative, unapologetically taking up space. Sarah would wake up from these dreams feeling both disturbed and strangely envious. Jung helped her understand. This dream figure was everything Sarah had exiled. The wild woman represented spontaneity, authentic desire, embodied power, sexual aliveness, all the qualities Sarah had sacrificed to become the acceptable spiritual teacher. As Sarah began to integrate this shadow material, the dream figure changed. She became less wild and more integrated. Eventually, in a powerful dream near the end of Sarah's solitude work, the wild woman and Sarah's conscious self merged into a single figure, wearing both the spiritual teacher's serene expression and the wild woman's confident, sensual energy. This dream marked Sarah's integration breakthrough. She wasn't split anymore between acceptable light and rejected dark. She was becoming whole. But let me be very clear about something. Shadow integration is not licensed to act out every dark impulse. There's a crucial difference between owning your shadow and being possessed by your shadow. Owning your shadow means, I am capable of cruelty and I choose not to enact it. Being possessed by your shadow means, I'm just being authentic as an excuse for being cruel. Owning your shadow means, I have selfish desires and I'll negotiate them consciously with others' needs. Being possessed by your shadow means, I'm honoring my truth as justification for pure selfishness. Owning your shadow means, I contain darkness and I hold it responsibly. Being possessed by your shadow means, this is just who I am, as abdication of consciousness. Jung was very clear on this distinction. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge. Notice that phrase, considerable moral effort. Shadow integration is not moral relativism. It's not anything goes. It's actually the opposite. It requires more moral consciousness, not less. You have to take responsibility for the darkness in you rather than pretending it doesn't exist or projecting it onto others. This is where many people misunderstand shadow work and use it as spiritual bypassing in a different direction. They swing from, I have no darkness, to, my darkness is just my authenticity, and anyone who has a problem with it is repressing their own shadow. Both positions are ego defenses. Both avoid the actual work. The actual work is holding the tension. I contain this darkness. It is real. It is part of me, and I am responsible for how I relate to it. Let me tell you about Marcus because his story illustrates a crucial aspect of shadow work that we haven't touched on yet. The golden shadow. Marcus came to therapy not because he was struggling, but because his life felt strangely flat. He was successful, good career, stable relationship, respected in his community, but he described feeling like, I'm living in grayscale. Everything works, but nothing excites me. During a period of extended solitude that Jung recommended, Marcus had a surprising discovery. His shadow didn't just contain negative qualities he'd repressed, it also contained positive qualities, power, ambition, creativity, charisma that he'd labeled as too much and had exiled. Marcus grew up in a family where standing out was dangerous. His father was threatened by any display of confidence from his children. His mother praised him for being humble and not full of himself. The implicit message, don't shine too bright, Don't be too big. Don't take up too much space. So Marcus learned to dim himself. He learned to be competent but not exceptional, helpful but not leading, present but not commanding attention, and all of his natural vitality, his authentic power, his creative fire, it went into shadow. Jung called this the golden shadow, the exiled qualities that are actually gifts, strengths, potentials that got labeled as dangerous or unacceptable. For many people, especially those raised in environments that punished bigness, the shadow contains not just their darkness, but their light. In Solitude, Marcus encountered this golden shadow in a powerful dream. He was in a museum looking at paintings, and in one painting was a figure who looked like him, but radiant, commanding, fully alive. The figure in the painting looked at Marcus and said, "When are you going to let me out?" This dream haunted Marcus because he realized the flatness he'd been experiencing wasn't depression. It was the natural result of having locked away half his vitality. He'd exiled his own aliveness because it felt too dangerous in his family of origin. Marcus's shadow integration work involved reclaiming these exiled gifts. He started speaking up more in meetings. He stopped apologizing for his ideas. He took on leadership roles he'd previously avoided. He allowed himself to be seen. This was terrifying for him, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt so right. The terror was, if I'm this much, will I be abandoned? Will I be attacked? Will I be too much for the people around me? Some people couldn't handle it. Some relationships did shift or end. But what Marcus discovered was that the people who mattered, the people capable of real connection, actually preferred the full power version of him to the dimmed-down version. They'd been waiting for him to stop hiding. This is a crucial point about shadow integration. It will disrupt your relationships because your relationships were formed based on who you were performing yourself to be, not who you actually are. When you start bringing the shadow into consciousness and integrating it, some people will experience this as betrayal. You're not the person I thought you were. And they're right, you're not. You're more than that person. You're more complete than that person. But more complete means more complex, and not everyone can handle complexity. Jung was very honest about this. The descent into the unconscious is not a family affair. Your individuation process will disturb the people around you. This is not a reason to avoid the work. It's a warning to be prepared for the consequences. Now let me address something that might be bothering you as you're listening to this. If I integrate my shadow, won't I become a worse person? Won't I become more selfish, more cruel, more of everything I've been trying not to be? This is the fear that keeps most people from doing shadow work, and it's based on a misunderstanding of what integration means. Integration doesn't mean acting out every shadow impulse. It means bringing shadow impulses into consciousness where they can be transformed. The shadow quality that remains unconscious is the one that controls you. The shadow quality you make conscious becomes workable. Here's a concrete example. Let's say your shadow contains greed. You've built an identity around being generous, not caring about money, being above materialistic concerns. But underneath, exiled in shadow, is a part of you that wants wealth, that counts what others have, that feels resentful when you give. If this greed remains unconscious, it will sabotage you. You'll give to others but feel martyred. You'll refuse to charge appropriately for your work and then resent your clients. You'll create financial crisis through generosity and then feel victimized by your circumstances. But if you bring this greed into consciousness, if you admit, yes, I want money, yes, I care about material security, yes, I'm not above these concerns, then you can work with it consciously. You can negotiate between generosity and self-interest. You can set healthy boundaries. You can be generous when it's genuine and not generous when it would be self-destructive. The integrated quality is actually more ethical than the repressed quality because it's conscious. You're making choices rather than being unconsciously controlled. Jung put it this way: everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The more you refuse your shadow, the more power it has over you unconsciously. The more you integrate your shadow, the more conscious choice you have. Let me give you another shadow practice for solitude. This one is about finding your golden shadow, the gifts you've exiled. The envy map. In solitude, make a list of people you envy, not people you admire in a distant way, but people whose lives or qualities trigger actual envy in you, that painful combination of wanting what they have and resenting them for having it. For each person, write specifically what you envy. Don't be general, they're successful. Be specific, they have the confidence to self-promote without apologizing. Now, here's the insight. Envy is a map to your golden shadow. The qualities you envy in others are almost always qualities you possess, but have exiled. You envy their confidence because you have confidence that you've suppressed. You envy their freedom because you have a desire for freedom that you've denied. You envy their creativity because you have creative gifts you've buried. Envy is your psyche saying, this quality exists in you too. Stop projecting it onto others and reclaim it. This practice can be revelatory in solitude because you can be honest about your envy without the social pressure to pretend you're above such petty emotions. Envy is not petty, it's informational. It's showing you what you've disowned that wants to come home. Sarah, our spiritual teacher, discovered through this practice that she deeply envied people who could be messy in public, people who would share their struggles, show their confusion, be imperfect without apologizing. She'd built her entire identity around having it together, being the one who helped others. But she envied people who could be helped, who could be vulnerable, who could be human in their flaws. This envy was pointing to her golden shadow, the capacity for vulnerability, for not knowing, for being imperfect. These weren't weaknesses to overcome. They were essential human qualities she'd had to exile to maintain her spiritual teacher persona. When she integrated this golden shadow, her teaching actually became more powerful because it became more real. She could share her own struggles, her own confusion, her own ongoing process. Students connected with her more deeply because she stopped performing enlightenment and started embodying the actual journey. Now I want to address one more aspect of shadow work that's crucial: the collective shadow. Jung didn't just talk about the personal shadow, the individual qualities you've exiled. He also talked about the collective shadow, the qualities our entire culture has exiled and projected onto scapegoated groups. In solitude, when you go deep enough into your personal shadow, you start to encounter collective shadow material. You start to see how much of what you've repressed wasn't just personal choice. It was cultural programming. You were taught what qualities are acceptable and unacceptable, not just by your individual family, but by your entire civilization. Different cultures exile different qualities into collective shadow. Some cultures shadow sexuality and embodiment. Others shadow anger and conflict. Others shadow vulnerability and emotional expression. Others shadow ambition and power-seeking. Whatever your culture collectively deems bad, that's what gets pushed into collective shadow, both in individuals and in the culture's shadow projections onto other groups. This is how racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression operate psychologically. The dominant group projects its own shadow onto marginalized groups and then persecutes those groups as a way of trying to destroy the shadow qualities they can't face in themselves. White supremacist cultures project sexuality and vitality onto black people and then either fetishize or demonize them. Patriarchal cultures project emotional sensitivity and vulnerability onto women and then either romanticize or devalue them. Heteronormative cultures project fluidity and nonconformity onto queer people and then either exoticize or criminalize them. The mechanics are identical to individual shadow projection. The quality is exiled, projected onto the other, and then attacked or exploited in that projected form. In Solitude, when you do deep shadow work, you start to see how much of your personal shadow is actually cultural shadow you've internalized. And you start to feel the responsibility that comes with this recognition. If I integrate my shadow, I'm not just healing myself. I'm withdrawing my participation in collective projection. If enough individuals integrate their shadow, collective shadow projections start to lose power. This is why individual psychological work is actually political work. It's withdrawing the energy that feeds collective pathology. Jung was very clear about this. If people can be educated to see the lowly side of their own natures, it may be hoped that they will also learn to understand and to love their fellow men better. A little less hypocrisy and a little more self-knowledge can only have good results in respect for our neighbor, for we are all too prone to transfer to our fellows the injustice and violence we inflict upon our own natures. Translation: when you stop splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts, you stop splitting the world into acceptable and unacceptable people. Shadow integration creates capacity for genuine love, because genuine love requires seeing the totality of another person, light and dark, without needing them to be only light. Sarah discovered this in her relationships. Before shadow work, she could only love people who fit her image of conscious or spiritual. Anyone who didn't meet that standard, she subtly rejected. After shadow work, she could love people in their full humanity, because she'd accepted herself in her full humanity. She stopped needing everyone to be on a spiritual path, because she'd stopped using spirituality as a defense against her own darkness. This is perhaps the most beautiful fruit of shadow integration. It makes you capable of actual love rather than conditional approval. Before we move to the next chapter, I want to leave you with the most important teaching about the shadow. Your shadow is not your enemy. Your shadow is the gatekeeper to your wholeness. Every quality you've exiled, every bad emotion, every unacceptable desire, every dark impulse contains energy that belongs to you. That energy doesn't disappear when you exile it. It just becomes unavailable for conscious use. When you integrate your shadow, you're not becoming darker, you're becoming more powerful, because you're reclaiming energy that was locked in the basement and bringing it upstairs where you can use it consciously. Jung wrote, "How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. You are not complete as only light. You are complete as light and dark held in conscious relationship." That's not moral relativism, it's psychological realism. And it's the foundation for every deeper stage of individuation we're going to explore. Comment shadow if you're recognizing aspects of yourself you've been keeping in the dark. And if you're feeling resistance to this chapter, if something in you is saying, "This doesn't apply to me, I don't have a shadow," that resistance is probably your shadow speaking, because the shadow's favorite trick is to convince you it doesn't exist. In the next chapter, we go even deeper. If the persona is the mask you show the world, and the shadow is what you hide even from yourself, there's another voice in your head that you might not have noticed. It's not your voice at all. It's the internalized voice of the collective, the jury that's always judging, always narrating, always telling you what you should think and feel and be. And in Solitude, that voice becomes unavoidable. Let's meet it now. There's a courtroom in your mind that's always in session. Right now, as you're watching this video, there's a voice commenting on what I'm saying. There's a voice evaluating whether you agree or disagree. There's a voice comparing this information to what you already believe. There's a voice judging whether you're understanding correctly, whether you're smart enough to grasp this, whether you should keep watching or do something else. That voice sounds like you. It uses first-person pronouns. It says, I think, and I feel, and I should. So naturally, you assume it is you. It's not. That voice is what Jung would call the internalized collective, the voice of parents, teachers, culture, religion, media, peer groups, all mashed together into an internal narrator that pretends to be your authentic self, but is actually a downloaded program running commentary on your life. And the most dangerous thing about this voice? It's so constant, so familiar, so identified with your sense of self that you don't even notice it's there. It's like background music in a store. You're not consciously hearing it, but it's affecting your mood, your choices, your behavior without your awareness. Solitude is where this voice becomes impossible to ignore, and solitude is where you discover the most disturbing truth. Most of what you call thinking is actually just the internalized collective speaking through you. Let me introduce you to the concept of psychological colonization. This is not Jung's term. I'm borrowing from post-colonial theory, but it describes what Jung observed about the psyche. Your inner territory has been occupied by external forces that pretend to be indigenous to you. Think about colonization in the political sense. A foreign power invades a land, claims it as their own, installs their government, their language, their laws, their religion, and eventually the colonized people start to identify with the colonizer's worldview. They start to see themselves through the colonizer's eyes. They start to police themselves according to the colonizer's values. The colonization becomes internal. This is exactly what happens psychologically. Your psyche, your inner territory, gets colonized by external programming, and eventually you start to see yourself through others' eyes. You start to police yourself according to their values. You start to narrate your experience in their language. The colonization is complete when you can't tell the difference between your authentic voice and the colonizer's voice speaking through you. Jung understood this profoundly. He wrote extensively about what he called psychic infection, the way collective ideas, beliefs, and values infiltrate individual consciousness and take it over. He watched this happen on a mass scale with the rise of Nazism in Germany. Millions of people whose individual consciousness was completely dissolved into collective ideology. But Jung insisted this mechanism isn't unique to fascism. It operates in every culture, in every individual. The content changes. Sometimes it's political ideology, sometimes it's religious dogma, sometimes it's cultural norms, sometimes it's family programming. But the mechanism is identical. External voices become internal voices, and you mistake them for your own. In solitude, you can finally hear how loud these voices are. Because when you remove all the external stimuli, no social media, no conversations, no news, no entertainment, the internal voices don't stop. They get louder. The jury is still in session, still commenting, still judging, still narrating. And this is when you realize, if I'm the one listening to these voices, who is speaking them? This recognition is the beginning of psychological decolonization. Let me tell you about James, a man in his early 50s who did a 40-day solitude retreat in a remote cabin. James was a successful therapist. He'd spent decades helping others with their psychological issues, studying consciousness, doing his own therapy work. He considered himself psychologically sophisticated. On day 7 of his solitude, James had what he described as a breakdown. He was sitting in meditation and suddenly became aware of a voice in his head that was viciously attacking him. "You're wasting your time here. This is self-indulgent. You should be working. You're being lazy. You're failing your responsibilities. You're not doing this right. You're not spiritual enough. You're too old to be figuring this out. You're pathetic." The voice was relentless. And James suddenly realized this voice had been running his entire life. It was always there, always criticizing, always finding him inadequate. He'd just learned to tune it out, to live with it as background noise. But in the silence of solitude, the voice was unavoidable. And James could finally hear it clearly enough to ask, "Whose voice is this?" The answer, when it came, was devastating. It was his father's voice. His father who had died 15 years earlier, but who apparently was still very much alive in James's psyche. Still running commentary, still judging, still finding James fundamentally lacking. James had spent years in therapy, processing his relationship with his father. He thought he'd done the work, but he'd never noticed that his father's voice had become his internal narrator, so identified with James's sense of self that James thought it was his own thinking. This is what Jung called a complex, an autonomous piece of the psyche that has split off from conscious control and runs its own programming. The father complex in James's case wasn't just memories or feelings about his father. It was his father internalized, still very much active in James's psyche. In solitude, complexes become visible because they can't hide in the noise of daily life. The father complex that was running underneath everything, undermining James's self-worth, driving his compulsive productivity, making rest feel like moral failure, finally got exposed. And this is when the real work began. James had to differentiate his actual thoughts from his father's internalized voice. He had to learn to recognize, "That's my father speaking, not me," and then choose whether to listen to that voice or not. This practice is what I call the voice inventory. And it's one of the most powerful practices you can do in solitude. Here's how it works. Sit in silence for at least 20 minutes. Have a journal nearby. As thoughts arise, don't engage with them or believe them. Instead, ask, "Whose voice is this?" When a critical thought arises, "You should be more productive." Ask, "Whose voice is that?" Is it your mother, your father, a teacher, cultural messaging about productivity, religious guilt about sloth? When an anxious thought arises, something bad is going to happen. Whose voice is that? Who taught you the world was dangerous? Who benefited from keeping you afraid? When a judgmental thought arises, that person is doing it wrong. Whose voice is that? Who taught you to judge? Who modeled that you should police others' behavior? Make a list of all the voices you discover. Give them names if that helps. Critical mother, anxious father, moral priest, competitive peer, capitalist culture, social media, validator. What you'll discover through this practice is shocking. Very few of your thoughts are actually yours. Most of your mental activity is just these internalized voices having conversations with each other, and you're witnessing the conversation while thinking you're having it. James discovered at least 7 distinct voices in his internal landscape. Critical father, constantly evaluating his worth based on productivity and achievement. Anxious mother, always warning him about danger, imagining worst-case scenarios. Rigid priest, judging him morally, finding him sinful or inadequate spiritually. Competitive peer, comparing him to others, making him feel behind or not successful enough. Capitalist productivity voice, telling him rest is wasteful, that his value comes from output. Therapeutic voice, ironically, a voice that psychoanalyzed everything, making even spontaneous emotions into problems to be solved. Social performer, narrating how he should present himself to maintain his image. 7 voices, all pretending to be James' thinking, when James could finally hear them as separate voices rather than as his identity. He had a profound realization. If I can hear all these voices, then I must be something other than these voices. But then, who am I? This is the question solitude forces. And this is the question the collective voice desperately doesn't want you to ask, because the moment you start to differentiate authentic self from internalized programming, you become ungovernable by that programming. Think about how much of your daily decision-making is actually just internalized voices pulling levers. You feel tired, but the productivity voice says you should keep working. You want to rest, but the guilt voice says that's lazy. You have an authentic emotion, but the control voice says don't feel that, it's too much. You have a desire, but the moral voice says that's selfish. You want to speak your truth, but the social voice says they'll judge you. Over and over all day, these voices override your authentic impulses, and you think you're making conscious choices. You think you're being reasonable, mature, responsible, but actually you're just being obedient to internalized authorities. Jung called this living in participation mystique, a French term he borrowed from anthropology to describe a state where individual consciousness is completely merged with collective consciousness. In tribal societies, individuals live in participation mystique with their tribe. They don't have a separate sense of self apart from the group identity. Jung observed that modern people think they've evolved beyond this, but actually they've just changed the content. Instead of merging with a tribe, they merge with culture, with ideology, with social media algorithms, with consumer identity. The mechanism is identical: individual consciousness dissolved into collective programming. And here's what makes this so insidious. The collective voice pretends to be protecting you. It says things like, "I'm just trying to help you be successful." Productivity voice, "I'm just trying to keep you safe." Anxiety voice, "I'm just trying to make you a good person." Moral voice, "I'm just trying to help you fit in." Social voice. These voices sound caring. They sound like they have your best interest in mind. And maybe the original sources, the actual parents, teachers, cultural forces, did intend to help. But the internalized versions have become tyrants. They're running programming that might have been adaptive in one context, but is now just imprisoning. James's critical father voice, for example, probably developed as a survival adaptation. James's actual father was unpredictable, sometimes praising, sometimes raging. Young James learned that if he constantly criticized himself first, he might avoid his father's criticism. Self-attack became a protection strategy. But James was 52 years old. His father was dead. And the protective strategy had long since become a prison. The voice was still attacking him for things that didn't matter, using standards that weren't even his, creating suffering in the name of keeping him safe from a danger that no longer existed. This is the tragedy of the internalized collective. It preserves the past in the present. It keeps you responding to old threats with old strategies, even when the circumstances have completely changed. In Solitude, you can finally see this. You can see that you're not living in present reality. You're living in a psychological time warp where your 5-year-old self is still trying to please a parent, where your adolescent self is still trying to fit in with peers, where your traumatized self is still trying to avoid old dangers. The present moment is actually silent. The present moment doesn't have a narrator. Right now, as you're watching this, there is just seeing, hearing, sensing. The experience itself is direct and immediate. It's the internal voices that are constantly pulling you out of present experience. Am I understanding this right? Should I be taking notes? Is this worth my time? What will I tell others about this? These voices are trying to process, evaluate, compare, judge, anything to avoid just being present with what is. Jung understood that the liberation from these voices isn't about destroying them. You can't destroy internalized programming just by wishing it away. The liberation comes from learning to observe them without identifying with them. This is the practice, he taught. I am not my thoughts. I am the awareness that witnesses thoughts. In solitude, you can practice this distinction. There's a thought. I should be doing something productive. Who is noticing that thought? There's an emotion, anxiety. Who is aware of that anxiety? There's a judgment. I'm doing this wrong. Who is observing that judgment? The witness, the awareness that's noticing all of this is closer to your authentic self than any of the content being noticed. But most people are so identified with the content that they never discover the witness. Let me share a practice that Jung developed, which he called objective observation. This practice can only be done effectively in solitude. Sit in silence. Allow your mental activity to continue without trying to control it. Instead of believing or engaging with thoughts, just observe them as though you're a scientist observing natural phenomena. Notice, there's a critical thought. Interesting. Oh, there's an anxious thought. How curious. Look, there's a fantasy about the future. Fascinating. Try to observe without judgment, not, I shouldn't be having this thought, but just, this thought is occurring. Notice the patterns. Do certain types of thoughts come in clusters? Do certain voices dominate certain times of day? What triggers shift your mental content? Most importantly, keep returning to the question, if I can observe these thoughts, then who am I? James practiced this for weeks during his solitude retreat, and gradually something shifted. The thoughts didn't stop. The voices didn't disappear, but James stopped being possessed by them. He could hear critical father voice criticizing him and think, oh, there's that voice again. Without believing it, without being wounded by it, without needing to argue with it or try to please it. This is the shift Jung called individuation, not the elimination of conditioning, but the differentiation from it. You're no longer unconsciously identified with the programming. You can see it, hear it, and choose whether to follow it or not. But this shift triggers enormous anxiety, because the collective voice isn't just neutral commentary. It's been functioning as your sense of security, your sense of belonging, your sense of knowing who you are. When you start to differentiate from it, when you start to say, that's not my voice, that's my father's voice, or that's not my truth, that's cultural programming, there's a terrifying gap that opens up. If you're not the good child pleasing your parents, then who are you? If you're not the successful person meeting cultural standards, then who are you? If you're not the spiritual seeker following the prescribed path, then who are you? The collective voice fills this gap with panic. If you stop listening to us, you'll be lost. You'll be alone. You'll be nothing. This is why Jung said that individuation requires enormous courage. You have to be willing to sit in the gap, the space between internalized identity and authentic self, without immediately filling it with a new program, a new voice, a new set of instructions. This gap is what he called the void, and most people can't tolerate it. They'll do anything to escape it, grab a new identity, a new ideology, a new guru, a new relationship, anything to fill the terrifying silence where they have to exist without external instruction. But Jung insisted, this void is actually the womb. This silence is where authentic self can finally be born. You have to be willing to be nothing before you can discover what you actually are. James spent almost 2 weeks in this void state. He described it as psychological free fall. None of his old certainties worked anymore. He couldn't rely on his internalized authorities because he'd seen through them. But he also hadn't yet made contact with whatever was more authentically him. He was just floating in uncertainty. This is the dark night that comes before dawn. And this is where most people turn back. They decide it was all a mistake, that questioning their internalized programming was dangerous, that they should just trust the voices and get back to normal life. James almost did this. On day 23 of his retreat, he packed his bags, ready to leave. He told himself, This was interesting, but I've gone far enough. I need to get back to real life. But then something stopped him. A different kind of voice, not one of the familiar ones, emerged in the silence. It was quieter, gentler, but more real. It simply said, "Stay." No explanation, no justification, no argument, just stay. James unpacked his bags and stayed. And over the next 17 days, he began to make contact with something he'd never encountered before, his actual self. Not the programmed self, not the adapted self, not the self that had been constructed by external forces, but the essential self that had been there all along, buried beneath all the voices. This self didn't speak in commands or criticisms. It spoke in quiet knowing. It didn't operate from fear or ambition. It operated from something James could only describe as organic rightness, a sense of what was actually true for him without needing external validation. When this self suggested he take a walk, it wasn't the productivity voice saying you should exercise. It was just the body's natural impulse to move. When this self suggested he rest, it wasn't the guilt voice saying you need to earn rest. It was just the organism's natural need for restoration. When this self suggested he write, it wasn't the achievement voice saying you should be productive. It was just the natural expression of thoughts that wanted to be articulated. Everything became simpler, more direct, more immediate. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." Looking outside means living according to external voices, always checking what others think, what culture says, what the programming dictates. It's dreamlike because you're not in contact with reality. You're in contact with a mediated, filtered, narrated version of reality. Looking inside means encountering direct experience beneath the narration. It's awakening because you finally make contact with what's actually true rather than what you've been told is true. But let me be very clear. This awakening is not a permanent state that you achieve once and maintain forever. The collective voices don't vanish just because you've seen through them. They keep arising. They keep trying to reassert control. James discovered this immediately when he returned from his retreat. Within days of being back in his regular life, surrounded by clients, colleagues, family, media, the old voices came roaring back. Critical father voice started evaluating his work. Social performer voice started managing his image. Productivity voice started demanding output. But here's what had changed. James could now recognize these voices as voices rather than as truth. He could hear critical father voice and think, "There's that program running again," without being devastated by it. He could notice social performer voice and make a conscious choice about whether to follow its directives or not. The voices had the same content, but James's relationship to them had fundamentally changed. He was no longer possessed by them. He could work with them consciously. This is what psychological decolonization looks like in practice, not the elimination of internalized programming, but the establishment of conscious relationship with it. You're no longer unconsciously obedient, you're consciously discerning. Let me give you a diagnostic tool for recognizing when you're being run by internalized voices versus when you're making authentic choices. Ask yourself these questions. When I make this choice, do I feel like I should or do I feel like I want to? Should is usually the collective voice. Want to, that comes from beneath the should, from a deeper, quieter place, is more likely authentic. Am I making this choice because I'm afraid of judgment or because it feels right? Fear-based choices are usually collective voice, protecting you from social consequences. Value-based choices from a place of groundedness are more likely authentic. Can I explain why I'm making this choice, or does it come from a pre-verbal knowing? Choices you can justify extensively are often collective voice speaking. You're performing reasoning for an imagined audience. Choices that come from simple, clear knowing, this is right for me, without need for justification, are more likely authentic. Does this choice energize me or deplete me? Collective voice choices often feel dutiful and depleting. You're doing what you should. Authentic choices, even difficult ones, usually have an aliveness to them. These aren't perfect diagnostics. Sometimes authentic choices feel like shoulds because you're genuinely aligned with values that happen to coincide with social norms. Sometimes collective voice can masquerade as authentic by using language like my truth or following my intuition. But these questions can help you start to develop discernment, the capacity to sense the difference between authentic inner authority and internalized outer authority. Jung emphasized that developing this discernment is the work of a lifetime. It's not something you achieve once and check off your list. It's an ongoing practice of differentiation, of paying attention to which voice is speaking, of making conscious choices rather than unconscious reactions. And this work can only be done effectively in solitude, because in solitude the voices have nowhere to hide. They can't blend into the background noise of social interaction, media consumption, constant activity. In the silence, you can finally hear them clearly enough to recognize them as voices rather than as you. One final teaching from Jung on this. He noticed that the collective voice is strongest around transitions and decisions. When you're about to make a significant life change, after his retreat, to make significant changes in his therapy practice. He'd been working in a prestigious clinic, seeing high-paying clients, maintaining the image of successful therapist. But during his solitude, he'd discovered that this work had become empty for him. What he actually wanted was to work with people who couldn't afford traditional therapy, to offer sliding scale sessions, to work in community centers, to prioritize service over status. The moment he started moving toward this change, the internal jury erupted. Critical father voice, you're throwing away everything you've built. This is stupid. Anxious mother voice, you won't have financial security. What if something goes wrong? Capitalist productivity. Voice, your value is determined by how much people pay for your time. Lowering your fees means you're worth less. Social performer. Voice, people will think you failed. They'll think you couldn't maintain your success. Competitive peer voice. Your colleagues will judge you for not maximizing your earning potential. Notice something. Every single one of these voices was speaking from fear and social conditioning. Not one of them was asking, what feels most alive to you? What feels most aligned with your actual values? What brings you meaning? Those questions come from a different source, from what Jung would call the self, capital S, the authentic organizing center of the psyche. We'll explore the self deeply in the next chapter, but for now, understand, the collective voice speaks from fear and conformity. The authentic self speaks from meaning and alignment. James learned to recognize this distinction. When the collective voices got loud, he would practice a simple technique. Thank you for sharing. I've heard your concern. I'm making this choice anyway. Not arguing with the voices, not trying to convince them, just acknowledging them and then acting from authentic authority rather than from internalized authority. This is mature psychological functioning. You don't silence the collective voice. You dethrone it. It can have a vote, but it doesn't get to be dictator. Now let me address something you might be experiencing as you watch this. The suspicion that what I'm calling the authentic self is just another voice, just another program, just another layer of conditioning pretending to be truth. This is a legitimate concern, and it's why solitude work is so important, because in extended silence, you can start to sense the qualitative difference between collective programming and authentic knowing. Collective programming has certain qualities. It's usually based in fear or social pressure. It's often comparative, better than or worse than. It needs justification and explanation. It changes based on who's watching. It feels like obligation or compulsion. It depletes your energy. Authentic knowing has different qualities. It's rooted in present moment awareness. It's non-comparative. Just, this is right for me. It doesn't need external validation. It's consistent regardless of audience. It feels like clarity or alignment. It generates energy even when difficult. These aren't absolute rules. The psyche is far too complex for simple binaries. But in solitude, as you practice witnessing your mental activity, you'll start to develop felt sense for these different qualities. You'll start to recognize, oh, that's fear-based programming versus, oh, that's authentic knowing. Jung called this capacity psychological discrimination, the ability to sort through the various voices and impulses in your psyche and discern which ones are serving your actual development versus which ones are just perpetuating old patterns. Let me share one more practice for developing this discrimination. The 3 questions practice. When you're facing a decision or noticing a strong impulse, pause and ask, 1. Whose voice is this? Identify the source. Is it your father, your culture, your trauma, your authentic knowing? 2. What is this voice protecting me from? Usually, collective voices are trying to protect you from something: judgment, failure, rejection, uncertainty. Name the fear. 3. What would I choose if I weren't afraid of that? This question bypasses the protective program and accesses deeper knowing. James used this practice when deciding about his career shift. Whose voice is saying I shouldn't do this? Critical father, capitalist productivity voice, social performer voice. What are they protecting me from? Judgment from colleagues, financial uncertainty, the possibility that I'll be seen as less successful. What would I choose if I weren't afraid of those things? I would do exactly what I'm planning: work with underserved populations, prioritize meaning over money, align my work with my actual values. This simple practice cut through weeks of mental spinning. The collective voices had legitimate concerns. Financial stability is real. Social consequences are real. But when James could see those concerns as protective programming rather than as ultimate truth, he could make a conscious choice about how much weight to give them. He chose to proceed with the career change while also building in some financial safeguards. He wasn't being reckless or rejecting practical considerations. He was integrating realistic concerns without being controlled by fear-based programming. This is the goal: not to eliminate the collective voice, but to establish conscious authority over it, to listen to it as information without being dominated by it as instruction. There's one more aspect of the collective voice I need to address before we move on: the spiritual collective voice. Many people who do consciousness work fall into a trap. They replace one set of collective programming with another. They move from conventional culture programming to spiritual culture programming, but the mechanism remains identical. Instead of the voice saying, you should be successful and productive, it says, you should be enlightened and transcendent. Instead of, you should look good and be impressive, it's, you should be humble and egoless. Instead of, you should achieve and compete, it's, you should surrender and serve. Different content, same structure. External authority dictating how you should be, what you should want, what counts as progress. Jung was very critical of people who used spiritual concepts as a new form of collective programming. He saw many patients who had escaped conventional conformity only to become rigidly conformist to spiritual ideals. The test is the same. Is this voice inviting you into your own direct experience and organic development? Or is it imposing an external template that you need to perform? Authentic spirituality, from Jung's perspective, emerges from individual encounter with the unconscious. It's discovered through your particular journey, your particular symbols, your particular relationship with what he called the self. It can't be downloaded from a teacher or tradition and applied as a program. But collective spiritual programming tries to do exactly that. Here's the right way to meditate. Here's the proper attitude to have. Here's what enlightenment looks like. Here's how awakened people behave. And sensitive people internalize this programming just as completely as they internalized their family or cultural programming. Then they spend years trying to live up to spiritual ideals, wondering why they still feel fundamentally incomplete. Because they've just traded one persona for another, one set of collective voices for another set. The mechanism of psychological colonization remains intact. Sarah, our spiritual teacher from Chapter 3, experienced this intensely. She'd spent 15 years internalizing spiritual teachings about compassion, non-attachment, transcending ego. These became her new collective voice, even more rigid than her original family programming because they were wrapped in the language of truth and liberation. In solitude, when she encountered her shadow rage and ambition, these spiritual voices went into overdrive. This rage proves you're not truly spiritual. Your ambition shows you haven't transcended ego. You're failing at consciousness. Sarah had to recognize these weren't the voice of genuine spirituality. These were the voice of spiritual programming, internalized ideals that were just as oppressive as any other internalized ideal. Genuine spirituality, she discovered, made room for all of her humanity, including the parts that didn't fit the spiritual ideal. It was about becoming whole, not about becoming good. This is Jung's radical contribution to spirituality. The goal is not to transcend your humanity in favor of some idealized spiritual state. The goal is to become fully, completely, authentically human, which includes both light and shadow, both spiritual aspiration and earthly desire, both transcendent experiences and embodied reality. The collective spiritual voice wants you to choose between human and divine. Jung says you're meant to integrate both. Before we transition to the next chapter, let me leave you with Jung's most important teaching about the collective voice. The collective unconscious is not to be thought of as a self-subsistent entity. It is no more than a potentiality handed down to us from primordial times in the specific form of mnemonic images or inherited in the anatomical structure of the brain. There are no inborn ideas, but there are inborn possibilities of ideas that set bounds to even the boldest fantasy and keep our fantasy activity within certain categories. What Jung is saying here, the collective programming in your psyche isn't evil or wrong. It's part of being human. We all inherit psychological structures, cultural conditioning, archetypal patterns. The question isn't whether these exist. They do. The question is, are you consciously relating to them, or are you unconsciously possessed by them? Solitude is where you learn to tell the difference. Comment, decolonize. If you're recognizing how many of your thoughts aren't actually yours, and if you're feeling some resistance or confusion right now, that's natural. The collective voice doesn't want to be exposed. It wants to remain invisible, authoritative, unquestioned. But you're seeing it now, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. In the next chapter, we go even deeper. We've explored the mask you show the world, persona, the darkness you hide from yourself, shadow, and the colonizing voices that pretend to be you, collective voice. Now we're ready to encounter something that's actually authentic, something Jung called the self, not the ego. Not the personality, not the constructed identity, but the self, the totality of your being, the organizing intelligence that's larger than your conscious awareness, the God image within. This is where psychology and spirituality converge. This is where the journey through solitude leads you to something genuinely transcendent. Let's meet it now. There is something in you that is organizing your existence. something you didn't create, something you can't control, something that's been orchestrating your development since before you had language to describe it. Jung called it the self, not yourself in the casual sense, not your personality, not your ego, not your identity. The self with a capital S, the totality of your being, the complete psyche, including both conscious and unconscious elements, the organizing center that your ego orbits around like a planet circling the sun. And here's what makes this concept both terrifying and liberating. Your ego is not in charge. You, the you that thinks it's making decisions, that thinks it's the author of your life, are not the center. You're one voice in a much larger conversation, being orchestrated by something that Jung could only describe as transcendent. Most people live their entire lives without discovering this. They remain ego-identified, believing that their conscious intentions and rational plans are what's running the show. And then they wonder why their lives keep moving in directions they didn't consciously choose, why they keep having experiences they can't explain, why there seems to be a pattern or intelligence operating beneath their conscious control. Solitude is where you can finally make contact with the self, because the self doesn't speak in words or concepts that the ego can understand. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in synchronicities, in the strange pull toward certain people or places or choices that you can't rationally explain but that feel undeniably right. And to hear that symbolic language, you need silence. Deep, extended silence where the ego's constant narration finally quiets enough for something else to be heard. Let me introduce you to Marcus. We met him briefly in Chapter 3 as the man who discovered his golden shadow, the qualities he'd exiled that were actually gifts. But Marcus's journey went much deeper than shadow integration. Marcus was a confirmed atheist, materialist worldview, scientific training, no interest in anything that couldn't be empirically verified. He'd always seen spirituality as sophisticated superstition, a comforting story people tell themselves to avoid facing the meaninglessness of existence. He went on a 3-month solo hiking expedition, not for spiritual reasons, but because he loved the physical challenge and the solitude. No agenda beyond walking, surviving, being in nature. Around week 6, something shifted. Marcus started having dreams that were qualitatively different from his normal dreams. These weren't the usual mental debris of daily processing. These were vivid, symbolic, and felt significant in a way he couldn't articulate. In one dream, he was climbing a mountain and discovered a cave. Inside the cave was a luminous geometric shape, a mandala made of light that was simultaneously still and rotating. As he looked at it, he felt himself being pulled into it, dissolving into it. And there was a voice, not audible but somehow present, that said, "This is what you've been seeking your entire life." Marcus woke up from this dream weeping, something he never did, and he had no framework to understand what had happened. His materialist worldview couldn't account for the numinous quality of this experience, for the undeniable sense that something real had been communicated to him. Over the remaining weeks of his journey, more of these dreams came, always with the same quality, symbolic, luminous, conveying meaning that bypassed his rational mind. And in his waking life, he started noticing what Jung would call synchronicities, moments where his internal state seemed mysteriously connected to external events. He'd be thinking about his estranged brother and suddenly see a hawk. His brother's childhood nickname was Hawk. He'd be wrestling with whether to change careers, and he'd find a book left on a trail bench titled The Road Less Traveled. Over and over, the boundary between inner and outer reality seemed porous in a way his worldview insisted was impossible. By the time Marcus returned from his journey, he hadn't become religious in any conventional sense, but his materialism had shattered. He'd encountered something he could only describe as an ordering intelligence, something that was orchestrating experiences, communicating through symbols, guiding development toward some kind of wholeness he didn't consciously understand. What Marcus had encountered was what Jung called the self. Jung spent decades trying to describe this phenomenon. He studied comparative religion, alchemy, mythology, trying to understand what different cultures had discovered about this organizing center of the psyche. And what he found was remarkable. Across cultures, across time periods, this experience of encountering something larger than ego that feels divine gets described in strikingly similar ways. In Christianity, it's the Christ within, the divine spark in every human. In Buddhism, it's the Buddha nature, the awakened consciousness that's your true nature. In Hinduism, it's Atman, the individual soul that's identical with Brahman, the universal soul. In alchemy, it's the philosopher's stone, the goal of transformation. In Taoism, it's alignment with the Tao, the natural way. Different symbols, different cultural contexts, but pointing to the same experiential reality. There is something in you that's larger than your ego, that has intelligence and purpose, that's guiding you toward wholeness. Jung called this the self. And he was very clear. He wasn't making a theological claim about God existing outside of you. He was making a psychological claim about an autonomous aspect of the psyche that functions as though it were divine, that has qualities of omniscience. It knows things your ego doesn't. Omnipresence, it's always there beneath consciousness. And purposiveness, it's moving you toward individuation. Whether this self is literally divine or just a very sophisticated psychological function, Jung said, is a question psychology can't answer. What psychology can document is the experience. People encounter this presence in their psyche. It transforms them. And it has been described religiously for thousands of years because religious language is the best available language for something that transcends ordinary ego consciousness. In solitude, this encounter becomes possible, even likely, because you're removing all the noise that keeps the ego dominant. Your ego needs constant reinforcement from external reality, checking your phone, getting validation, solving problems, making decisions, managing your image. When you remove all of that in deep solitude, the ego naturally weakens. Not pathologically, naturally. It stops being the center of your experience, and in that space, the self can emerge. But let me warn you, this is not comfortable. Meeting the self is not like meeting a loving parental figure who approves of everything you're doing. The self is impersonal. It's not concerned with your ego's preferences, your plans, your comfort. It's concerned with your wholeness, your individuation, which often requires destroying the structures your ego has built. Jung described it like this: the self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. The self is a quantity that is superordinate to the conscious ego. It embraces not only the conscious but also the unconscious psyche and is therefore, so to speak, a personality which we also are. Notice that language. A personality which we also are. You are not just your ego. You're also this larger self that contains your ego as one part of a much more complete whole. Think about it in terms of the sun and planets metaphor. Your ego thinks it's the center. It experiences itself as the reference point around which everything else revolves. But from a more complete perspective, your ego is actually a planet orbiting the self, which is the sun, the actual center, the thing generating energy and light, the thing that the whole system is organized around. This recognition is simultaneously humbling and liberating. Humbling because it means your ego is not in charge. Your plans, your preferences, your sense of control are actually subordinate to something larger. Liberating because it means you're not alone. There's an intelligence deeper than your conscious mind that's been guiding you all along. Marcus experienced this dramatically. After his hiking journey, he returned to his work as an engineer, but he felt profoundly restless. His rational mind said, "You have a good job, you're successful, there's no reason to change anything." But something deeper, what he now recognized as the self, was insisting something needed to shift. He started paying attention to his dreams, which continued to be vivid and symbolic, and a pattern emerged. Over and over, his dreams contained images of teaching, of sharing knowledge, of working with young people. This made no sense to his ego. He'd never been interested in education. He didn't particularly like teenagers. He had no background in teaching. But the dreams persisted, and then synchronicities started pointing in the same direction. He'd overhear conversations about a new STEM education nonprofit. He'd randomly meet a former teacher who'd tell him how fulfilling the work was. An article about the need for engineers in education would land in front of him. His ego resisted. This is confirmation bias. You're seeing patterns because you're looking for them. Don't make a career change based on dreams and coincidences. But the self kept pushing, and finally, Marcus made a decision that felt insane to his rational mind, but deeply right to something else. He applied to be a high school STEM teacher. He took a significant pay cut, went back to school for certification, completely reorganized his life. And this is the remarkable part. It was exactly right. Teaching awakened something in Marcus he didn't know existed. He wasn't just transferring information, he was helping young people discover their own potential. He felt aligned in a way he'd never experienced in his engineering career, despite that career being objectively more successful by conventional measures. This is what it means when Jung says the self is guiding you toward individuation. It's not guiding you toward comfort or conventional success. It's guiding you toward becoming who you actually are, which may require completely disrupting who your ego thinks you should be. Now let me address something important. How do you distinguish genuine self-guidance from ego inflation? This is crucial because the ego can hijack spiritual language and use it to justify its own agenda. The ego can say, "The universe is telling me to," when actually it just wants something and is using spiritual language as justification. Jung was extremely concerned about this, what he called inflation, when the ego identifies with archetypal or spiritual content and becomes grandiose. This is how spiritual teachers become abusive cult leaders, how ordinary people become convinced they're prophets or messiahs, how psychological language gets weaponized for manipulation. So here's the diagnostic. Genuine self-guidance usually challenges your ego's preferences and comfort, leads you toward more complexity and paradox, not simplistic answers, requires sacrifice of ego's attachments, produces humility. You're serving something larger, not aggrandizing yourself, can be tested through lived experience. Does following this guidance actually lead to growth or just to ego satisfaction? Generates creative energy and aliveness, even when difficult, often requires waiting, patience, not knowing. Ego inflation disguised as self-guidance conveniently aligns with what your ego already wants, provides certainty and absolutes. I know the truth and others don't, doesn't require sacrifice. You get to have everything you want and call it spiritual, produces grandiosity. You're special, chosen, more evolved than others, can't be questioned. Any doubt is labeled as resistance or lack of faith, generates excitement and sense of superiority, demands immediate action based on special knowledge. The simplest test Jung offered. Does this voice ask you to become more than you currently are, self? Or does it tell you you're already special and different from everyone else? Ego inflation. The self is always calling you toward growth, toward integration of shadow, toward more consciousness. It's work. It's challenging. It requires facing what you'd rather avoid. Ego inflation tells you you've already arrived. You're already enlightened. You already see what others don't. It's flattering. It's comfortable. It allows you to skip the actual work of transformation. Marcus could have fallen into inflation. He could have interpreted his dreams and synchronicities as the universe chose me for a special mission. Instead, he remained humble. He saw himself as responding to guidance, not as being special. This kept him in right relationship with the self. Sarah, our spiritual teacher, provides a cautionary example of inflation that got corrected through solitude. Before her shadow work, Sarah had unconsciously inflated. She identified with the spiritual teacher archetype and believed she was more evolved than her students. She wasn't doing this maliciously. She genuinely believed she'd transcended ego concerns that her students still struggled with. Her shadow eruption during solitude, the rage, the ambition, the recognition of her own unconsciousness, shattered this inflation. She had to face that she wasn't the evolved being she thought she was. She was just a person on a journey, same as everyone else. This was devastating to her ego, but it was essential for her actual development. Only after the inflation collapsed could she make genuine contact with the self, not as Sarah the enlightened teacher, but as Sarah the human being, with her particular path, her particular gifts, her particular shadow, all held within something larger that was guiding her toward wholeness. Jung wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. Your ego is the center of your conscious awareness. The self is the center of your total being. Everything you know about yourself and everything you don't know, everything you've accepted and everything you've rejected, everything you've developed and everything that's still potential. The journey of individuation is the ego progressively discovering its right relationship to the self, not identifying with it, inflation, not ignoring it, ego dominance, but serving it. The ego becomes the conscious instrument through which the self expresses itself in the world. This is what religious traditions mean when they talk about surrendering to God's will, or aligning with the Tao, or letting Buddha nature express through you. Jung secularized this as psychological language, but the experience is the same. Your small self learning to serve your larger self. In solitude, this relationship becomes palpable. You start to notice the difference between I want, ego, and I'm drawn toward, self. You start to recognize that your most important life decisions weren't actually made by your conscious mind. Something deeper chose them, and your ego rationalized them afterward. Think about the major turning points in your life. Falling in love with a particular person, choosing a certain career, moving to a specific city, ending a relationship, starting a creative project. If you're honest, these decisions usually didn't come from careful rational analysis. They came from something less articulable, a pull, a knowing, a sense that this is what I need to do, even when it made no logical sense. That's the self communicating, through intuition, through dreams, through the strange attraction to certain paths and people, through the dissatisfaction that won't let you settle for less than your authentic development. Jung developed a practice for consciously engaging with the self that he taught to many of his patients. He called it holding the tension of opposites, and we'll explore it more fully in Chapter 9. But the basic principle is this: the ego wants to resolve complexity into simple answers. It wants to decide this is good, that's bad. I should do this, not that. This is me, that's not me. The ego wants clarity, certainty, control. The self operates in paradox. It holds opposites, light and shadow, success and failure, love and hate, life and death, without needing to collapse them into singular truth. The self is comfortable with mystery, with not knowing, with allowing complexity to remain complex. In solitude, you practice staying present with paradox without premature resolution. You hold the question without rushing to an answer. You sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to create certainty. This is almost unbearable for the ego. The ego experiences this as torture. Just tell me what to do. Just give me the answer. Just make this clear. But the self insists, sit with it. Let it ripen. Let the answer emerge organically rather than forcing it prematurely. Marcus experienced this with his career decision. His ego wanted to immediately figure out, should I stay in engineering or become a teacher? It wanted pros, cons lists, rational analysis, clear decision criteria. But when Marcus brought this question into meditation and dream work, into relationship with the self, what he got wasn't a clear answer. What he got was more complexity, more questions, more uncertainty. His dreams showed him both paths. His synchronicities pointed in conflicting directions. His intuition said yes and no simultaneously. This was maddening for his rational mind. But it was exactly what the self was requiring, that Marcus sit in the tension without knowing, that he hold the question long enough for a true answer to emerge rather than a premature resolution that would close down possibility. After 3 months of this discomfort, something shifted. Marcus had a dream where he saw himself as both engineer and teacher, not choosing between them, but finding a way to integrate both. And suddenly, options emerged that his either-or thinking had made invisible, teaching STEM, bringing engineering approaches into education, creating programs that bridged both worlds. The self had been holding a more complete solution than his ego's binary thinking allowed. But to access that solution, Marcus had to first endure the discomfort of not knowing, of holding opposites without resolution. This is what Jung meant when he said, the self has a kind of omniscience, not that it literally knows everything, but that it has access to the total psyche, including unconscious contents that contain possibilities and solutions the ego can't imagine. Your ego operates from what it consciously knows. The self operates from the totality. Everything you know and everything you don't yet know, you know. Which means the self can guide you toward futures that your ego can't envision. But, and this is crucial, the self doesn't override your free will. It guides, suggests, creates conditions and synchronicities, but you still have to choose. You still have to take the risk of following the guidance, even when it makes no logical sense. Jung insisted on this. Individuation is not passive reception of the self's will. It's active collaboration between ego and self. The ego has to remain strong, conscious, capable of discrimination. What changes is that the ego stops trying to be in charge and learns to be in partnership with something larger. Let me share something personal. About 5 years ago, I had a vivid dream that I should create educational content about Jung's work. This made no sense to my ego. I wasn't a psychologist or therapist. I had no platform. I'd never created video content. The whole idea seemed presumptuous and impractical, but the dream was so insistent, so numinous in quality that I couldn't ignore it. So I started, nervously, uncertainly, with massive imposter syndrome. I made terrible videos at first. I had no idea what I was doing. My ego was convinced this was a mistake, but something kept pushing me forward, not my conscious ambition, something deeper. And gradually, the work found its audience. People started resonating with the content in ways I never imagined. And I realized this wasn't about me. This was the self expressing through me, using my particular configuration of interests and abilities for something larger than my personal agenda. I still have to show up and do the work. The self doesn't make the videos for me. But the direction, the energy, the sense of rightness about this path that comes from something deeper than my ego's preferences or ambitions. This is what Jung meant about serving the self. You become a conscious vehicle for something that's trying to express itself through your particular life. And here's what's both terrifying and exhilarating about this. You don't get to choose what the self asks of you. You can refuse. You can ignore the dreams, dismiss the synchronicities, rationalize away the intuitive pulls. Many people do. They spend their lives living according to ego's agenda, never making contact with the deeper intelligence trying to guide them. But if you choose to listen, if you choose to follow, you're committing to something that will reorganize your entire existence. The self doesn't respect your carefully constructed life plans. It a career shift, a relationship ending, a move to a new city, a creative risk. The collective voice gets extremely loud. What will people think? You should be more practical. This is irresponsible. You're being selfish. You're going to regret this. Who do you think you are? These voices aren't trying to help you make a good decision. They're trying to keep you in the familiar territory, where collective programming feels safe and comfortable. They're trying to prevent individuation because individuation means betraying the collective's expectations of you. James experienced this intensely when he decided, we'll dismantle them if they're not aligned with your authentic development. This is why Jung said, individuation is not for the faint of heart. It requires enormous courage to let the self guide you, knowing it might ask you to abandon the very things your ego has spent years building. Career, relationships, identity, security, social status. Let me tell you about Emma. Emma came to therapy in her early 50s with what she described as a depression I can't shake. She'd done everything her culture told her would create a meaningful life. Successful marriage, raised 3 kids, built a career in marketing, maintained a beautiful home, stayed physically fit, cultivated friendships. By every external measure, she was living well. But inside, Emma described feeling dead. Not dramatically suicidal, just flatly, numbingly dead, like she was watching herself live a life that no longer belonged to her. Jung recognized this immediately. Emma was experiencing what he called the midlife death of the ego. The self was preparing her for a major transformation, and the first stage was the death of her current identity structure. During a period of intensive therapy combined with solitude practice, Emma began having powerful dreams. In one recurring dream, she was in her house, but the house was burning down. Instead of feeling panicked, she felt strangely calm, even peaceful, and in the dream, she would walk out of the burning house into a landscape she'd never seen before. Wild, untamed, beautiful. Jung helped her understand. The burning house was her current life structure, and the self was telling her it needed to burn. Not literally, she didn't need to actually abandon her family or set her house on fire, but the psychological structure, the identity she'd built, the way she'd been living, that needed to die so something new could be born. Emma's ego was terrified by this. I can't just throw away everything I've built. What would people think? What about my responsibilities? What if I'm just being selfish? But the depression wouldn't lift, and Jung helped her see. The depression wasn't pathology. The depression was the self refusing to animate a life that was no longer aligned with Emma's authentic development. Her psyche was essentially on strike, saying, I will not provide energy for this performance anymore. Over months of work, Emma began to listen to what the self was asking, and what emerged was surprising. The self wasn't asking her to abandon her life. It was asking her to live it differently, from a different center. Emma had spent 5 decades living for others, for her parents' approval, for her husband's needs, for her children's development, for her career's demands, for society's expectations. She'd never once asked, what do I actually want? What brings me alive? What is my particular path? In solitude, she finally asked those questions, and the answers that emerged were not what her ego expected. Emma discovered she wanted to paint, something she'd done as a teenager but had abandoned as impractical. She wanted to spend significant time alone, not out of rejection of her family, but out of genuine need for solitude. She wanted to let her body age naturally without the constant anti-aging vigilance her culture demanded. She wanted to speak more honestly, even when it made people uncomfortable. None of this was dramatic, no affair, no walkabout, no radical life overhaul, but it was profound. Emma was shifting from living according to external scripts to living according to internal authority. She was learning to listen to the self rather than to the collective voices that had dominated her entire life. And as she made this shift, the depression lifted. Not immediately, this wasn't a quick fix, but gradually, steadily, her vitality returned. The flatness gave way to aliveness. The sense of going through the motions gave way to genuine presence, because she was finally living her life, not performing someone else's version of what her life should be. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. The self knows your particular shape, your particular nature, your particular path. But you have to be willing to listen beneath the collective programming that tries to force everyone into the same template." In solitude, Emma could finally hear the self's guidance because all the external noise was removed. The expectations, the shoulds, the social pressure, none of it was present in her solitude practice. Just her and the deeper intelligence trying to guide her toward her authentic life. Now let me address something crucial about the self that Jung spent years trying to articulate. The self is not just your personal psychology. It's also transpersonal. It connects you to something larger than your individual existence. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche that's shared by all humans, containing archetypal patterns, universal symbols, species-wide psychological structures. We'll explore this more fully in Chapter 11, but for now, understand. When you make contact with the self, you're not just discovering your individual nature, you're also discovering your connection to humanity as a whole. This is why self-encounters often feel religious or spiritual, because you're touching something that transcends your personal story. You're making contact with patterns and energies that have been moving through human consciousness for millennia. Marcus experienced this dramatically during his hiking journey. In one of his dreams, he encountered a wise old man figure, what Jung called the Senex archetype. This figure appeared spontaneously in the dream, spoke wisdom Marcus didn't consciously possess, and felt more real than most of Marcus's waking experiences. Marcus had never studied Jung, had never heard of the Senex archetype. But when he later researched his dreams, he discovered that this exact figure appears across cultures, across time periods. The wise old man who guides the hero, who provides knowledge, who represents the deep wisdom of the self. Marcus hadn't invented this figure. He'd encountered an archetypal pattern that's part of humanity's collective psychological inheritance. This recognition was both humbling and awe-inspiring. He wasn't alone in his individual psyche. He was connected to patterns that millions of humans, across thousands of years, had also encountered. This is what Jung meant when he said the self is the God image within. Not that you are God in an inflated sense, but that there is something in your psyche that functions like what humans have always called divine. It's wise beyond your conscious knowing. It's connected to universal patterns. It's guiding you toward wholeness. It transcends your individual ego. Different cultures give this different names. Holy Spirit, Atman, Buddha nature, the Tao, the higher self, Christ consciousness, the inner light. Jung wasn't claiming these are all the same thing. He was observing that humans across cultures have this experience of encountering something in their own depths that feels transcendent. And he was insisting This is not mere projection or wishful thinking. This is a legitimate psychological phenomenon that can be studied, mapped, worked with therapeutically. In solitude, you can make direct contact with this presence, not through belief or faith, through experience, through dreams that convey wisdom you don't consciously possess, through intuitions that turn out to be accurate in ways that defy rational explanation, through synchronicities that suggest your inner state is mysteriously connected to outer events. These experiences don't prove anything in a scientific sense, but they shift your relationship to existence. You stop feeling like an isolated ego struggling alone in an indifferent universe. You start sensing yourself as part of a larger intelligence, a larger pattern, a larger story. Jung put it this way: the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. Your ego is the center of your conscious life, your thoughts, your plans, your daily experience. The self is the center of your total life, including all the unconscious dimensions, all the archetypal patterns, all the connection to humanity's shared psychological inheritance. Individuation is the progressive revelation of this larger totality. You start identified completely with ego, thinking that's all you are. Through solitude, through shadow work, through dream analysis, through active imagination, you gradually discover more and more of what you actually are, including dimensions that feel transpersonal, universal, even cosmic. This can sound grandiose, and it would be grandiose if you were claiming, "I am special because I've discovered this." But Jung's point is the opposite. Everyone has a self. Everyone has access to these deeper dimensions. Most people just never do the work of making conscious contact with it. You're not special for having a self. You're human. What's rare is being willing to do the solitude work, the shadow work, the uncomfortable descent into your own depths that's required to make this contact conscious. And here's what Jung insisted: making this contact conscious is the most important work you can do, not just for yourself, but for the world. Because unconscious people who are completely ego-identified, who have no relationship to the deeper self, are dangerous. They can be manipulated by collective ideologies. They can project their shadow onto scapegoated groups. They can enact destruction while believing they're doing good. They can be possessed by archetypal energies without any consciousness of what's operating through them. History is full of this. Leaders possessed by power archetypes who think they're serving their nation. Spiritual teachers possessed by savior archetypes who think they're enlightened. Activists possessed by warrior archetypes who think they're fighting for justice. All of them unconsciously identified with archetypal energies, all of them causing damage while believing they're serving good. Conscious relationship with the self. Knowing that you're more than your ego, that archetypal energies move through you, that you're connected to something larger, creates humility and responsibility. You stop inflating. You stop thinking your ego's agenda is ultimate truth. You start serving something larger with awareness of both its power and its danger. This is why Jung insisted that individuation is ethical work, not just psychological work. It's about becoming conscious enough to be responsible for the energies moving through you rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. Let me give you a practice for beginning conscious relationship with the self. The self-dialogue practice. This builds on active imagination, which we'll explore fully in Chapter 7, but you can begin now. 1. Create sacred space in solitude. Light a candle, sit in a place that feels special. Signal to your psyche that this is intentional, important work. 2. Ask a question of your deeper self. Not your ego, not your rational mind, your deeper knowing. Frame it clearly. What do I need to know right now? Or, what is my next step? Or, what am I not seeing? 3. Wait in silence. This is crucial. Don't immediately try to answer the question with your ego. Just hold the question in open, receptive silence. 4. Notice what emerges. It might be an image, a feeling, a memory, a bodily sensation, words that arise spontaneously. Don't judge or interpret yet. Just notice. 5. Respond to what emerged. If an image came, ask it questions. If words came, write them down and ask for clarification. If a feeling arose, explore it. You're entering into dialogue, not just passively receiving. 6. Test the guidance. Jung insisted on this. Spiritual experiences need to be tested through lived reality. If the self seems to be guiding you in a direction, try it. See what happens. Does it lead to growth or just to ego satisfaction? This practice won't work like a vending machine. You don't input a question and get an immediate, clear answer. The self communicates in its own timing, its own language. But if you maintain this practice in solitude over time, you'll start to develop a felt sense of when it's ego speaking versus when it's something deeper. Marcus used a version of this practice throughout his hiking journey. Every morning he would sit in meditation and ask, "What is this journey teaching me?" He didn't expect verbal answers, but over time, patterns emerged. Dreams intensified, synchronicities increased, and gradually the teaching became clear, not as intellectual understanding, but as lived knowing. Emma used this practice to navigate her midlife transformation. When she felt lost or confused about what the self was asking of her, she would sit in silence and ask for clarity. Sometimes nothing came. Sometimes dreams that night would provide images. Sometimes in the days following, synchronicities would point in a direction. It wasn't magic, it wasn't always clear, but it was real, a genuine conversation between her conscious ego and the deeper organizing intelligence of her total being. Before we move to the next chapter, I want to leave you with Jung's most important teaching about the self. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. The self is not out there. It's not in a guru, a teaching, a tradition, a practice. It's in your own depths, waiting to be discovered. Everything external can only point you back to that inner encounter. This is why solitude is irreplaceable, because you can't discover what's in your depths while you're constantly oriented outward. You have to turn inward. You have to face the totality of your being, ego and shadow, persona and authentic self, personal and transpersonal. And when you do, when you make genuine contact with the self, everything changes, not because your external circumstances necessarily change, though they might, but because your relationship to existence itself transforms. You stop feeling like an isolated fragment struggling to create meaning in a meaningless universe. You start experiencing yourself as an expression of something larger, a particular note in a cosmic symphony, a unique manifestation of an intelligence that's been orchestrating development since before you had words for it. This doesn't answer all your questions. It doesn't eliminate suffering or confusion, but it provides what Jung called a sense of meaning that can sustain you through anything life brings. Comment self if you're recognizing that there's something in you larger than your ego, something that's been guiding you all along. In the next chapter, we explore how solitude becomes the alchemical vessel where transformation occurs. We've identified the false self, persona, confronted the rejected self, shadow, recognized the colonizing voices, collective programming, and made contact with the authentic organizing center, self. Now we need to understand the actual process of transformation. How you move from fragmentation to integration, from unconsciousness to consciousness, from ego dominance to ego-self partnership. Jung found the perfect metaphor for this in medieval alchemy. Let's enter the laboratory now. The medieval alchemists spent lifetimes in their laboratories, obsessively trying to transform lead into gold. They failed, of course, at least at the literal level. You can't turn base metal into precious metal through heating and mixing and prayer. But Jung discovered something remarkable. The alchemists weren't actually talking about literal metals, or rather, they were talking about metals, but the metals were symbols for psychological processes. The alchemical texts were encoded maps of transformation, instructions for how to turn the lead of unconscious, fragmented existence into the gold of integrated conscious being. The laboratory wasn't external. The laboratory was the psyche itself, and the alchemical vessel where transformation occurred, that vessel was solitude. This is going to sound esoteric. Stay with me, because once you understand the alchemical framework Jung discovered, you'll have a map for understanding exactly what's happening during the confusing, painful, chaotic process of psychological transformation. The alchemists described their work in stages. Different traditions use different numbers of stages, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 7, sometimes 12. But the core pattern was consistent. You take raw material, prima materia, you subject it to various operations: dissolution, separation, purification, conjunction, and eventually, if the work is done correctly, you produce gold, the philosopher's stone. Jung spent years studying these texts, and he realized they're describing individuation. They're describing the exact process his patients go through when they do deep psychological work. They're describing what happens in solitude when you allow transformation to occur. Let me map the 3 major stages that appear consistently across alchemical traditions. Negrado, the blackening. This is the death stage, the descent into darkness, the encounter with shadow, the dissolution of false identity, the experience of depression or despair. Everything false has to die before anything authentic can be born. This stage is characterized by darkness, putrefaction, mortality, the encounter with death, both literal and psychological. Albido, the whitening. This is the purification stage. After the death and dissolution of Negrado, there's a washing, a clarifying, a process of separating what's essential from what's not. This stage is characterized by clarity, discrimination, the ability to see clearly without the distortions of ego or shadow. It's often experienced as a period of calm after intense storm. Rubido, the reddening. This is the integration stage. The elements that were separated in Albido are now reunited in a new form. Opposites are married, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter. This stage is characterized by vitality, embodiment, the capacity to live in the world while maintaining connection to the depths. The gold has been created. Now here's why this matters. Modern psychology and psychiatry have completely pathologized the Negrado stage. When someone enters darkness, depression, disillusionment, despair, the medical model says, this is illness. This needs to be fixed immediately. Medicate it, therapize it, make it go away. And sometimes that's appropriate. Clinical depression that's purely neurochemical needs medical intervention. But Jung observed that much of what gets labeled as depression is actually Negrado, a sacred descent, a necessary death of false structures, the first stage of alchemical transformation. When you medicate away or therapy away a Negrado process, you interrupt the transformation. You keep the person trapped in their old structures because you won't let the death occur that would allow rebirth. This is controversial. I'm not saying all depression is sacred. I'm saying some of what gets called depression is actually the psyche's healthy response to an inauthentic life. It's the self refusing to provide energy for false existence, creating darkness so that genuine transformation can occur. And if you interrupt this process prematurely, you abort the possibility of transformation. Let me tell you about Emma's Negrado. We met Emma in the last chapter, the woman in her 50s experiencing what she called depression I can't shake. Her conventional therapist had prescribed antidepressants, which Emma tried for 6 months. They didn't lift the depression. They just made her feel numb. She couldn't access joy, but she also couldn't access the depths of what the depression was trying to communicate. When Emma came to a Jungian therapist and described her situation, the response was different. What if this depression isn't the problem? What if it's information? What is it telling you? This question opened everything, because Emma had been fighting the depression, trying to make it go away, treating it as an enemy. When she started listening to it as information, a completely different story emerged. The depression was telling her, the life you're living is dead. The identity you've built is false. The performance you're maintaining is killing your soul. I am the death of that false life, so a true life can emerge. This reframe changed everything. Emma stopped trying to escape the depression and started entering it. She stopped treating darkness as pathology and started treating it as initiation. This is terrifying to the ego. The ego interprets darkness as danger. Something is wrong. I need to fix this. I need to get back to normal. But Jung would say, darkness might be exactly right. Darkness might be the medicine. Darkness might be the Negrado dissolution that's required before anything new can form. Emma spent 6 months in what she described as the underworld. She withdrew from many of her social commitments. She spent significant time in solitude. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of the grief, rage, and despair that had been building for decades. This looked like breakdown from the outside. Her family was concerned, her friends worried. Even her Jungian therapist had to hold faith that this was process, not pathology. But Emma stayed with it. She trusted that the darkness had purpose. And gradually, not suddenly, gradually, something began to shift. The Albido began to emerge. After the death and dissolution of Negrado, Emma experienced a period of unexpected clarity. She could suddenly see patterns that had been invisible. She could recognize the ways she'd been living according to scripts that weren't hers. She could distinguish authentic desires from programmed obligations. This clarity felt like washing, like years of accumulated mud being cleaned away, revealing the actual landscape underneath. Emma described it as finally being able to see clearly after decades of looking through dirty windows. In this Albido stage, Emma did the discrimination work. What actually matters to me versus what I've been told should matter? What brings me alive versus what I've been performing out of duty? Who am I when no masks are required? This was still uncomfortable. Discrimination means letting go of aspects of life and identity that no longer serve. Emma had to acknowledge that certain friendships were based entirely on mutual performance and had no authentic connection. She had to recognize that aspects of her marriage had become hollow ritual without genuine intimacy. She had to admit that her career success meant nothing to her actual soul. These recognitions hurt, but they were true. And truth, even painful truth, felt more nourishing than the comfortable lies she'd been living. Then, almost a year into her process, Emma entered Rubido. The elements that had been separated, her public life and her private truth, her responsibilities to others and her responsibility to herself, her role as mother, wife, professional, and her identity as a whole human being, began to integrate into something new. She didn't abandon her life, but she inhabited it differently. She could be a wife while also being autonomous. She could be a mother while also having strong boundaries. She could be professional while also being authentic. The opposites that had been split, either or thinking, became both and reality, and her vitality returned. Not the manic productivity of her earlier life, but something deeper, a groundedness, an aliveness that came from living in integrity with her actual self rather than in performance for external approval. This is the gold. Not literal riches, not external success, but psychological integration, the capacity to be whole rather than fragmented, authentic rather than performed, aligned with the self rather than possessed by ego or collective programming. The alchemical transformation took Emma approximately 18 months, from Negrado through Albido to Rubido. This is not unusual. Genuine transformation is not a weekend workshop or a 6-week course. It's a process that occurs in psyche's timing, not ego's preferences. And here's the crucial point. This transformation could only occur in solitude. Or more precisely, it required regular, consistent solitude practice alongside engagement with life. Emma couldn't have done this transformation while remaining constantly busy, constantly socially engaged, constantly performing. The alchemical vessel, the contained space where transformation occurs, was her solitude practice. This is where she could feel the full weight of Negrado without immediately escaping into distraction. This is where Albido clarity could emerge without being drowned out by external noise. This is where Rubido integration could be tested and refined. Jung understood solitude as the alchemical vessel, the hermetically sealed container where transformation can occur without being interrupted or contaminated by external interference. In literal alchemy, you had to seal the vessel completely or the volatile substances would escape and the work would fail. In psychological alchemy, solitude is that seal, the protected space where volatile psychological contents can be worked with without escaping into projection, acting out, or dissociation. Now let me map each alchemical stage onto the solitude experience more specifically. Negrado in solitude. When you first enter extended solitude, there's often a honeymoon period, maybe a day or two where it feels peaceful, restful, refreshing. Then Negrado hits. You become intensely aware of everything you've been avoiding, all the emotions you've been suppressing through constant activity, and distraction come flooding up. Grief, rage, shame, terror, loneliness, not the loneliness of being without others, but the loneliness of finally confronting how disconnected you are from yourself. The persona starts to crumble because there's no audience to perform for. The shadow emerges because there's no external stimulation to keep it suppressed. The collective voices get deafeningly loud because they panic when you're not reinforcing their authority through obedience. This is hell. This is why most people can't stay in solitude for more than a few hours. Negrado is unbearable to the ego. Everything the ego has constructed to create security and stability starts dissolving. Jung would say, let it dissolve. This dissolution is necessary. You're not having a breakdown, you're having a break open. The false structures have to die so authentic structure can form. Albido in solitude. If you stay with Negrado, if you don't prematurely escape back into distraction and performance, something remarkable happens. The chaos settles, the emotional storm passes, and you're left with silence, real silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of clarity. In this Albido stage, you can see your life with previously impossible objectivity. You're not identified with your emotions anymore. You can observe them. You're not possessed by your thoughts. You can witness them. You're not trapped in your stories. You can recognize them as stories. This is the discrimination phase. You start to sort through everything. This belief is actually mine. This belief was installed by my parents. This desire is authentic. This desire is compensation for trauma. This relationship nourishes my soul. This relationship is just mutual performance. The clarity can be startling. How did I not see this before? The answer, you couldn't see it while you were identified with it. Only in the distance created by solitude, distance from your normal life, distance from your habitual patterns. Can you see clearly? Rubido in Solitude. After the death of Negrado and the clarity of Albido, something new wants to be born. Not a return to your old life that's been exposed as inadequate, not a complete abandonment of your old life. There are elements worth preserving, but a new configuration, a new relationship to existence. In Rubido, you start to feel the opposites coming together. You can hold both your need for connection and your need for solitude. You can integrate both your light qualities and your shadow. You can be both grounded in reality and connected to transcendent depths. You can be both uniquely individual and part of the collective human story. This integration isn't intellectual, it's experiential. You feel it in your body as a sense of rightness, of alignment, of coming home to yourself. Jung called this the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites that produces the gold of integrated consciousness. And crucially, this Rubido stage propels you back into the world. The alchemical work isn't complete until the gold is brought out of the laboratory and put to use. You don't stay in solitude forever. You return to life, but transformed. You bring the consciousness you've developed back to your relationships, your work, your community, your ordinary existence. This is the difference between spiritual bypassing and genuine transformation. Spiritual bypassing stays in the purity of solitude, avoiding the complexity of embodied life. Genuine transformation uses solitude as the laboratory, then returns to test the work in the messy reality of human existence. Let me address something important. The alchemical stages don't occur once and then you're done. They cycle. You'll go through Negrado multiple times in your life, each time at a deeper level, each time with different material to be dissolved. You'll experience Albido clarity repeatedly. You'll undergo Rubido integration again and again. This isn't failure, it's the spiral nature of growth. You don't achieve enlightenment and maintain it forever. You individuate in stages, each stage requiring its own death, clarity, rebirth cycle. Jung himself went through multiple Negrado experiences. His famous confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 and 1916 was his major Negrado, a period where his professional identity collapsed, his certainties dissolved, his grip on reality felt tenuous. He could have pathologized this and ended his career. Instead, he entered it fully, used it as alchemical material, and emerged with the foundational insights that would define his life's work. But even after that major transformation, Jung experienced smaller Negrado periods throughout his life, times when new material needed to be confronted, new structures needed to dissolve, new integration needed to occur. This is the realistic picture of transformation, not one dramatic breakthrough that fixes everything, but an ongoing relationship with the alchemical process, dying and being reborn multiple times, each cycle taking you deeper into authenticity. Now let me give you a practice for working consciously with the alchemical stages in solitude, the alchemical journal practice. During any extended solitude period, ideally at least a few days, but you can adapt this to shorter periods. 1. Negrado recognition. When darkness, despair, or disillusionment arises, don't immediately try to fix it or escape it. Instead, journal. What is dying right now? What identity, belief, structure is dissolving? What is this darkness telling me about my life? If this dissolution is necessary, what might it be making space for? 2. Albido inquiry. When clarity begins to emerge, and you'll know it by the quality of seeing through illusion, journal. What can I see now that I couldn't see before? What is essential versus what is extraneous? What wants to be kept versus what needs to be released? 3. Rubido integration. When you feel synthesis occurring, opposites coming together, new possibilities emerging, journal. What opposites are being reconciled in me? What new configuration of my life is emerging? How do I bring this integration into embodied action? This practice helps you work consciously with the alchemical process, rather than being unconsciously swept through it. You become the alchemist, not just the raw material. Emma used a version of this throughout her transformation. Looking back at her journals, she could see the clear progression. Months of Negrado entries expressing grief, rage, despair, dissolution. Then a shift into Albido entries where clarity began emerging. Lists of what was true versus false in her life. Discriminations between authentic and performed aspects of self. Then Rubido entries where integration was occurring. Plans for how to reconfigure her life. Experiments in living differently. Reflections on bringing her inner transformation into outer expression. The journal became her alchemical record, documentation of the transformation that she could refer back to when doubt arose, when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when she needed reminder of what she'd discovered. One final teaching about the alchemical process. Jung emphasized that transformation requires what the alchemists called heat. You can't transform lead into gold at room temperature. You need intense heat, pressure, intensity, the kind of conditions that break down existing structures. Psychologically, this heat comes from staying with discomfort, from not escaping when things get hard, from allowing yourself to feel the full intensity of emotions you'd rather avoid, from sitting with uncertainty rather than immediately grasping for answers. Most people keep their psychological temperature too low for transformation. They're comfortable, which means nothing is breaking down, nothing is dissolving, nothing is transforming. They might be safe, but they're not growing. Solitude turns up the heat. Without distraction and escape routes, the intensity increases. Emotions that would normally be managed become overwhelming. Questions that would normally be avoided become unavoidable. The heat rises until transformation becomes inevitable. This is why solitude feels so intense. You're experiencing the alchemical heat directly without cooling mechanisms. Your psyche is literally cooking, breaking down old structures, reconfiguring into new forms. And yes, this is uncomfortable. Yes, there's a reason people avoid it. But discomfort is not the enemy. Premature comfort is the enemy. Premature comfort keeps you trapped in forms that no longer serve. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The alchemical darkness, Negrado, is not a problem to be solved. It's a stage to be honored, entered, allowed to do its necessary work of dissolution. Comment transformation if you're recognizing that some of your darkest periods might have been alchemical stages rather than just pathology. If you're seeing that the breakdown you experienced might have been the breaking open required for genuine transformation. In the next chapter, we explore one of Jung's most powerful practices, active imagination. This is the technique he developed for consciously engaging with unconscious contents, for having literal dialogues with shadow figures, with dream characters, with archetypal presences. It's strange, it's powerful, it can only be done effectively in solitude, and it's one of the most direct methods for accelerating the alchemical transformation we've been exploring. Let's enter that practice now.